Hello and welcome. Tonight we travel not just across space, but across a vast and misty chasm of time. Our destination is an island on the very edge of the known world, a place the Romans knew as Hibernia, the land of winter. It is a landscape of raw, breathtaking beauty, of green hills that roll into grey, churning seas, of sudden, violent squalls and the ethereal golden light that follows. Here, on the windswept coasts and in the secluded, silent river valleys of medieval Ireland, a unique and powerful flame was kindled, while the great engine of the Roman Empire sputtered and died, plunging Europe into a long and uncertain twilight. These small, isolated communities of faith became the unlikely custodians of a flickering candle. They were the keepers of memory, the guardians of knowledge, in an age of profound forgetting. Imagine a man, his face weathered by salt spray and prayer, standing on a cliff edge looking west, with nothing between him and the horizon but an endless expanse of angry ocean. To him, this was not a place of desolation, but a place of profound connection. This was the very precipice of the world, where the mundane fell away and the eternal began. The monasteries that these men built were not grand, continental cathedrals of soaring stone and stained glass. They were humble, resilient clusters of stone cells, clinging to the earth like lichens to a rock. By all logic, these remote outposts should have been footnotes in history, lost to the mist they inhabited. Instead, they became the blazing intellectual heart of Christendom, a network of scholarship and artistry so vibrant that its influence would radiate outwards, reseeding a continent that had lost its way. So how did this happen? How did an island that was never conquered by the Roman legions, a land without cities or written laws, become the saviour of the very classical learning it had never formally inherited? Tonight, we will attempt to answer that question. We will walk the cold stone floors of their simple chapels and hear the echo of the psalms sung in the dark hours before dawn. We will enter the scriptorium, the quiet engine room of this cultural miracle, and feel the patient dedication of the scribes who bent over vellum pages for a lifetime. We will follow the perilous voyages of Ireland's missionary saints, the spiritual adventurers who carried their books and their fierce devotion across a fractured Europe. We will explore a life of extreme hardship and profound beauty, a life dedicated entirely to God, which in a paradox that echoes through the centuries ended up saving the memory of the pagan world. This channel is a labour of love, and your support in sharing this journey with others is deeply appreciated. If you find value in these explorations of the past, taking a moment to leave a like or to subscribe for future journeys is a simple and wonderful way to help these stories reach a wider audience. It is a small gesture that means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you might be joining me from tonight. It is a quiet reminder of the community we build here, united by a shared fascination for the echoes of history. And now, settle in. Let the noise and the demands of the modern world fade into the background. Let the screen in front of you become a window into a different time. Let us travel back to a world lit only by fire and faith, to the green shores of early medieval Ireland, and to the quiet, disciplined, and extraordinary life of the men who called it home. Before we can step across the threshold of the monastery, we must first understand the world from which it grew. The Ireland of the 5th century, the Ireland that awaited the arrival of Christianity, was a land shaped by myth and by the raw power of nature. It was a mosaic of petty kingdoms, or tuatha, each ruled by its own chieftain, or ri. There were no cities, no grand stone monuments to power. Instead, life was rural, pastoral, and deeply tied to the land. Power was measured not in gold or territory, but in cattle. Society was a complex web of clan loyalties, of obligations and honour, governed by an unwritten intricate system of law known as the Brehon Laws, which were memorised and recited by a specialised class of jurists. This was a world steeped in the oral tradition. History, genealogy and law were not written down, but were held in the formidable memories of the poets, the Fili and the Druids. These figures were more than mere priests or entertainers. They were the living libraries of their people, the guardians of the collective soul of the clan. They sang of epic battles, of cattle raids like the great Tainbo Quailnge, and of the Tuatha De Danann, the magical godlike people who were said to have inhabited Ireland before the arrival of mortals. The air itself seemed thick with stories, the landscape populated by unseen forces. Every well, every ancient tree, every oddly shaped stone could be a gateway to the otherworld, a place that existed parallel to the human realm, beautiful and perilous in equal measure. Into this world, a world without a Roman past, Christianity arrived not with the sword of a conqueror, but with the quiet footsteps of a former slave. The story of St. Patrick is, of course, shrouded in legend, but the historical reality is even more compelling. He was a Romanised Briton, captured by Irish raiders in his youth, and forced to work as a shepherd. It was in this lonely, harsh captivity that his faith deepened. After 6 years he escaped, but he was forever haunted by his time in Ireland. He heard in a dream the voice of the Irish calling him back, and so he returned, not for vengeance, but for evangelism. He understood the people and their culture from the inside. He did not seek to obliterate the old ways, but to sanctify them. This process of conversion was one of assimilation, not replacement. The old, pagan festivals were subtly transformed into Christian holy days. Imbolc became St. Brigid's Day. Beltane and Samhain would eventually find echoes in the Christian calendar. Holy wells, once sacred to Celtic deities, were rededicated to Christian saints. Even the symbol of the Celtic cross with its iconic ring is believed by many to represent this fusion. The circle, a powerful pagan symbol of the sun or eternity, interwoven with the cross of Christ. This genius for synthesis meant that Christianity in Ireland put down deep, authentic roots. It was not a foreign imposition, but a new shoot grafted onto an ancient tree. It became uniquely, powerfully, and enduringly Irish. From this fertile ground grew a new kind of spiritual ideal. In the rest of the crumbling Roman world, the ultimate expression of faith was often seen as red martyrdom, to die for Christ, as the early Christians had in the arenas. But in an island that was converting peacefully, there were few opportunities for such a sacrifice. So the Irish monks conceived of 2 new paths. The first was green martyrdom, the idea of living a life of extreme asceticism, of battling one's own demons in the wilderness of Ireland itself, effectively dying to the world through prayer and fasting. The second, and perhaps the more influential, was white martyrdom, or peregrinatio pro Christo, to go into voluntary permanent exile for the love of God. This meant leaving behind everything, family, clan, home, which, in the Irish kinship-based society, was a kind of social death, a sacrifice as profound as any other. This ideal of spiritual exile would become the driving force behind the explosive growth of Irish monasticism. It was not a retreat from the world so much as a strategic repositioning. These men sought out the wildest, most remote places imaginable, storm-lashed islands, lonely lake shores, impenetrable valleys, to create their communities. They were seeking the desert, the Gaelic word for desert, a place of solitude where they could confront God without distraction. It was in these deserts of the Irish landscape that they would build their formidable spiritual fortresses, and from these bases the white martyrs would eventually set sail, carrying the fire of their faith and learning to the darkened shores of Britain and continental Europe. Their goal was exile, but their legacy would be the rebuilding of a civilization. The men who felt this profound call came from every strata of Gaelic society. For some, it was a pure and simple vocation, an undeniable pull towards a life of contemplation. For others, the motivations were more complex, woven into the very fabric of their world. A younger son of a chieftain, with no prospect of inheriting land or title, might find in the monastery a different kind of power, a path to becoming an abbot, a figure of immense spiritual and often temporal authority. In a world of endemic low-level warfare, the monastery offered sanctuary. A man fleeing from a blood feud or seeking refuge from a crime could find safety within its hallowed walls, a space where the law of the land gave way to the law of God. Scholars, drawn by the growing reputation of monastic schools, would travel across Ireland, and eventually across Europe, to sit at the feet of a renowned teacher. The elderly and the infirm, with no family to care for them, could find a form of social security, a place to live out their final days in peace and prayer in exchange for whatever service they could offer. The monastery was thus a curious microcosm of the world it had renounced, a magnet for souls seeking something beyond the endless cycle of planting, harvesting and fighting. It was a place of purpose in a world that often seemed chaotic and fleeting. The journey to becoming a monk began with a period of trial, the novitiate. An aspiring monk or postulant would arrive at the monastery gates and be placed under the guidance of a senior monk, the master of novices. This was a time of intense observation and introspection. The postulant's sincerity, his temperament, his physical and spiritual resilience were all put to the test. He would be taught the rudiments of the monastic life, the cycle of daily prayers, the chants of the psalms, the rules of silence in the refectory and the chapel, and the virtue of absolute obedience. It was a period designed to systematically dismantle the life he had known before. This was a profound psychological unmaking and remaking. The postulant had to learn to subordinate his own will, his personal desires, and his individual identity to the collective rhythm of the community and the authority of the abbot. He was shedding the skin of his former self, the son, the warrior, the farmer, and slowly, painfully, weaving a new identity as a servant of God. It was a period of deep spiritual struggle, a confrontation with one's own pride, attachments, and weaknesses. Many did not complete it. But for those who did, for those who endured this crucible, the novitiate culminated in a solemn ceremony where they would take their vows. These vows were the three pillars upon which the entire monastic life was built: poverty, chastity, and obedience. In the context of early medieval Ireland, each represented a radical departure from the prevailing social norms. The vow of poverty meant renouncing all personal possessions. In a society where a man's status was visibly demonstrated by the cattle he owned, the fine clothes he wore, and the weapons he carried, to willingly embrace having nothing was a revolutionary act. It was a statement that true wealth was not of this world. The monk's only possessions were his simple woolen habit, perhaps a drinking vessel, and the shared tools of the community. The vow of chastity was an equally profound rejection of the secular world. Gaelic society was built on the foundation of the family and the clan. Lineage was everything. To produce heirs, particularly sons, was the primary duty of any man of standing. To willingly renounce marriage and family was to sever the most fundamental tie that bound a person to society, to deliberately extinguish one's own bloodline. It was a radical act of reorientation, turning away from the future of the clan and towards the eternity of the soul. It freed the monk from earthly distractions and allowed him to focus his entire being on the divine. Finally, and perhaps most challenging of all, was the vow of obedience. The monk swore to obey the abbot as he would obey God himself, without question or delay. In a culture of proud and often fractious warriors, where personal honour and loyalty to one's chieftain were paramount, submitting one's will entirely to another was the ultimate act of humility. The abbot, the abbess or father of the community, held absolute authority. His word was law. This vow was the mortar that held the monastic community together, transforming a collection of individuals into a single, unified body, moving in concert to the rhythms of prayer and work, all directed towards a single, transcendent purpose. The physical location of an Irish monastery was a theological statement in itself. The founders were not seeking convenient fertile plains or strategic crossroads. They were seeking the edge of things. They followed the ideal of the desert fathers of Egypt and Syria, who believed that true spiritual clarity could only be found in solitude, in places of harsh, elemental beauty, far from the corrupting influence of society. The Irish landscape, with its vast bogs, its dense forests, its lonely mountains, and its thousands of islands, offered an abundance of such deserts. Consider Skellig Michael, a jagged pinnacle of rock thrusting out of the Atlantic, 8 miles off the coast of Kerry. To build a monastery here seems less an act of architecture and more an act of sheer defiant faith. Monks would have had to sail across a treacherous stretch of ocean, scale the near-vertical cliffs, and then, with the most basic of tools, construct their stone beehive huts, their oratory, and their gardens on tiny man-made terraces. They were choosing to live in a place where the primary neighbours were the sea, the sky, and the screaming colonies of gannets and puffins. It was a life lived in constant, intimate dialogue with the raw, untamed power of God's creation. Or think of Glendalough, the valley of the two lakes founded by St. Kevin. He sought solitude in a place of almost oppressive beauty, a deep glacial valley enclosed by steep, forested mountains. Legend says he first lived as a hermit in a tiny man-made cave, a deer stone high on the valley side. From this single seed of devotion, a great monastic city would eventually grow, but its origins lay in that fundamental impulse to withdraw, to find a place where the noise of the world was drowned out by the whisper of the wind through the oaks and the lapping of water on the shore. These locations were chosen not for their comfort, but for their ability to strip away the trivial and focus the soul on the eternal. The first thing a visitor would encounter at any monastery was the vallum, or enclosing wall. This was far more than a simple defensive structure, though it certainly served that purpose later. It was first and foremost a profound symbolic boundary. It was a line drawn upon the earth, separating the sacred space within from the profane, chaotic world without. To pass through the gate of the vallum was to leave the realm of chieftains and cattle raids and enter the kingdom of God. Inside this sacred precinct, a different kind of time was kept, measured not by seasons, but by the ringing of a bell calling the community to prayer. The wall created a space of intense focus, a spiritual crucible where the work of salvation could be undertaken. At the very heart of this sacred enclosure stood the oratory, the small church where the monks gathered for the divine office and the Mass. Early Irish churches were remarkably simple and uniform in their design. They were small, rectangular buildings, constructed of either timber or stone, with a high-pitched roof. They were unadorned, lacking the grand naves or transepts of continental churches. Their defining feature was their orientation. They were built on an east-west axis, with a single small window in the eastern wall. This was so that the first rays of the rising sun, a powerful symbol of the resurrected Christ, would illuminate the altar during the morning Mass. The interior was dark, cold, and resonant, a space designed not for visual spectacle, but for the spoken and chanted word of God to echo and penetrate the soul. Rising above the low stone buildings, a singular and iconic feature of the Irish monastic landscape would come to dominate the skyline, the cloitiche, or round tower. These elegant tapering stone towers, some reaching over 100 feet into the air, were masterpieces of dry stone construction. Their primary purpose was that of a bell tower, their Irish name literally meaning bell house. From the topmost level, a handbell would be rung to signal the canonical hours, its sound carrying for miles across the countryside, regulating the life of both the monastery and the surrounding lay community. But they were also watchtowers, providing an early warning of approaching visitors, whether friend or foe. And in the dark centuries to come, they would become the community's ultimate defence, a treasury for precious manuscripts and relics, and a virtually impregnable refuge of a last resort when the longships of the Vikings appeared on the horizon. If the oratory was the soul of the monastery, the scriptorium was its mind. There was often no dedicated building for this purpose in early monasteries. Rather, it was a space, perhaps a corner of a larger building or a specific cell, where the sacred work of copying was undertaken. The conditions were almost unimaginable to the modern mind. It was a cold, often damp space, with light provided by a single, small, unglazed window, perhaps covered with a translucent sheet of stretched animal intestine. The only heat came from the scribe's own body. Fire was a constant, terrifying threat to the precious collection of books, so open flames were forbidden. The air would have been thick with the smell of wood smoke from elsewhere in the settlement, mixed with the sharp, metallic scent of iron gall ink, the animal scent of the vellum, and the sweet perfume of melting beeswax for sealing. Silence was the rule. The only sounds would be the whisper of a turning page, the rhythmic, hypnotic scratch of a goose-feather quill on a prepared animal skin, and perhaps the murmur of a monk quietly reading a passage aloud to himself, a common practice in an age where reading was a vocal, embodied act. This was not a place of creative expression in the modern sense. It was a place of meticulous, prayerful duplication. The scribe saw himself not as an author, but as a vessel, a conduit through which the sacred word could be preserved and transmitted, uncorrupted, to future generations. His work was an act of profound humility and devotion, a physical manifestation of his commitment to the Word of God. The refectory, or dining hall, was another place governed by strict rules and ritual. Meals were not social occasions, but extensions of the community's life of prayer. They were eaten in complete silence, the only sound being the voice of a single monk, designated for the week, reading aloud from a sacred text, the life of a saint, a passage from the Bible, or the writings of a church father. The food itself was simple and austere, reflecting the vow of poverty and the ascetic spirit of the community. A typical meal might consist of bread made from oats or barley, milk, cheese, eggs, and perhaps fish from the nearby river or sea. Meat was generally reserved for feast days, or for feeding the sick and the monastery's guests. The act of eating was transformed from a simple necessity into a moment of collective spiritual nourishment, feeding the soul as much as the body. The individual monks' living quarters reflected this same spirit of austerity. In the earliest and most remote monasteries like Skellig Michael, these were the famous clochars, or beehive huts. These were marvels of corbelled dry stone construction, built without any mortar. From the outside they look like primitive mounds of stone, but inside they are a perfect weatherproof dome, a small, dark, womb-like space. Later, in larger monasteries, the cells might be simple huts of timber or wattle and daub, arranged in neat rows. Inside, the furnishings were brutally simple: a stone slab or a straw-filled pallet for a bed, a rough woolen blanket, perhaps a wooden crucifix on the wall. This was not a home, it was a spiritual battleground, a private space for the monk to wage his personal war against temptation through solitary prayer and contemplation, a cell in the larger organism of the community. Despite their inward focus, these monasteries were not entirely cut off from the world. Hospitality, or philoxenia, was a sacred Christian duty, and the Irish monks took it with the utmost seriousness. Every monastery had a guest house, or hospitium, located near the main gate, where travellers could find food and shelter. The guests were a constant, flowing river of secular life passing through the spiritual fortress. They might be humble pilgrims on their way to a holy well or shrine. They could be travelling scholars from Britain or Gaul seeking the famous schools of Clonmacnoise or Bangor. They could be local chieftains with their entourages coming to consult the abbot, who was often a kinsman and a man of great influence. For a night, all were welcomed, their feet washed, their hunger sated. The guest house was the monastery's ear to the world, a place where news was exchanged and connections were maintained. A monastery was also a bustling, self-sufficient economic entity. It had to be. In its remote location, it could not rely on outside trade for its survival. The principle of ora et labora, prayer and work, governed the day. While the choir monks dedicated most of their time to prayer and study, a large part of the community, including lay brothers who had not taken full vows, was engaged in constant physical labour. The monastery owned vast tracts of land, which had to be cleared, ploughed, planted, and harvested. They kept herds of cattle and sheep. They built mills on the rivers to grind their grain, and breweries to make ale, the staple drink of the age. They were skilled craftsmen, blacksmiths who forged tools and bells, carpenters who raised roofs, and stonemasons who built the chapels and towers that would endure for 1,000 years. This constant work was not seen as a distraction from the spiritual life, but as an essential part of it, a form of prayer enacted with the hands, grounding the soul in the simple, honest realities of the physical world. The entire existence of a monk was structured by a relentless, unchanging cycle of prayer known as the divine office, or the canonical hours. Life was not measured in hours and minutes, but by the 8 sacred intervals that punctuated the day and night. This rhythm was the heartbeat of the monastery, a constant stream of praise and supplication that rose from the community to God. It began in the dead of night, long before the first hint of dawn. The monks would be woken from their cold slumber by the ringing of a handbell for matins, the night office. They would file into the pitch-black freezing oratory, their breath pluming in the air, and for the next hour or more, the darkness would be filled with the sound of chanted psalms, hymns, and readings. This was a profound act of devotion, a vigil kept while the rest of the world slept. As the first grey light began to silhouette the eastern window, they would gather again for lauds, the prayer of praise at dawn, greeting the rising sun as a symbol of the risen Christ. Throughout the day, the bell would ring out, calling them from their work in the fields or the scriptorium for the little hours of prime, terce, sext, and nun, sanctifying every part of the day with a brief return to the chapel. In the evening, as the light began to fail, they celebrated Vespers, the evening prayer, and finally, just before retiring to their cells, they would assemble for Compline, the final prayer of the day, committing their souls to God's protection through the coming darkness. This unceasing cycle was the framework on which everything else was built. It transformed time itself from a linear progression into a sacred, repeating loop of worship. Beyond the divine office, the central act of collective worship was the celebration of the Mass. This was the moment when the community believed heaven and earth truly met, when the sacrifice of Christ was made present again on the simple stone altar. The ritual, the liturgy, the solemnity of the moment would have been the spiritual peak of the day or the week. It was the ultimate source of grace and strength for the arduous life they had chosen, a direct and tangible connection to the divine mystery that was the entire reason for their existence. When the monks were not in the chapel, they were engaged in labor work. For many, this meant the hard, physical toil that sustained the community. They were farmers, following the rhythm of the seasons. In spring, they broke the earth with heavy wooden ploughs pulled by oxen, planting oats and barley. In summer, they weeded the fields and tended the vegetable gardens that provided much of their food. In autumn, the harvest was a period of intense communal effort, bringing in the grain that would see them through the long, dark winter. They were shepherds, watching over the monastery's flocks on the hillsides, and fishermen, casting nets into the rivers and the sea. This was humbling, grounding work, a constant reminder of their dependence on God's providence and the goodness of the earth. But for a select group, the most important work took place not in the fields, but in the quiet intensity of the scriptorium. It was here that the Irish monks performed their most enduring service to history. This was the intellectual labour, the painstaking act of copying and preserving the written word. To understand the magnitude of their achievement, we must first understand the tools they used, for each was the product of a slow and deliberate craft. The pen was a quill, typically fashioned from the primary flight feather of a goose or swan. The scribe would carefully select a feather, harden it by curing it in hot sand, and then, with a sharp knife, carve a precise, chisel-shaped nib. The quality of this point was crucial, determining the flow of ink and the character of the script itself. It had to be constantly resharpened, a tiny, repetitive act of maintenance in a process defined by patience. The ink they used was a minor miracle of medieval chemistry. The most common form was iron gall ink. It was made by crushing oak galls, the hard round growths that form on oak trees where a wasp has laid its eggs, and mixing the powdered galls with water and ferrous sulfate, a mineral known as vitriol. A binder, usually gum arabic from the acacia tree, was added to give the ink body and help it adhere to the page. The result was a rich, purplish-black ink that, over time, would fade to a deep brown, the characteristic colour of so many ancient manuscripts. For illustrations and headings, a vibrant palette of colours was created from natural sources: red from red lead, or the ochre of iron oxide, yellow from the mineral orpiment, green from malachite, blue from the precious lapis lazuli imported from as far away as Afghanistan, and a brilliant purple from certain types of shellfish. Each colour was a testament to a deep knowledge of the natural world and a far-reaching network of trade. But the most crucial element, the very canvas for their work, was vellum. This was no simple paper. It was a specially prepared animal skin, usually from a calf, vellum, or a sheep, parchment. The process of creating a single sheet was laborious and time-consuming. First, the animal's skin was soaked in a lime solution for several days to loosen the hair and fat. Then, it was stretched taut on a wooden frame, where a monk using a curved crescent-shaped knife called a lanellum would painstakingly scrape both sides of the skin, removing any remaining hair and tissue. The skin was scraped and tightened, over and over again, until it became a thin, smooth, and almost translucent sheet. Finally, it was dusted with chalk or pumice powder to create a perfectly receptive, slightly abrasive surface for the ink. It has been estimated that the creation of a single large book, like the Book of Kells, would have required the hides of over 150 calves. It was an astonishing investment of time, resources, and skilled labour. With his materials finally prepared, the scribe could begin. The first step was to rule the vellum page. Using a straight edge and a dry point, a sharp, pointed tool of metal or bone, he would press faint invisible guidelines into the surface. This grid of horizontal lines for the text and vertical lines for the margins ensured that the final script would be perfectly uniform and beautiful to the eye. Only then would he dip his quill into the ink pot and begin the slow, deliberate process of copying. He would read a line from the source manuscript, the exemplar, commit it to memory, and then write it out onto the new page. The script he used was a unique Irish development, a beautiful, rounded hand known as insular majuscule, or a more rapid, pointed version called insular minuscule. His body would be hunched over the slanted writing desk for hours on end, his eyes straining in the dim light. It was physically punishing work, leading to arthritis, back pain, and failing eyesight. Yet they persisted, seeing their labour as a prayer, each perfectly formed letter a tribute to the glory of God. The texts they copied were, first and foremost, the essential documents of their faith. The Bible was the primary subject, especially the four Gospels and the Book of Psalms, which formed the core of their daily worship. They copied the writings of the great Latin Church Fathers, Augustine, Jerome, Ambrose, Gregory the Great, and the lives of the saints, particularly Irish saints, whose stories provided models of heroic faith. But their work did not stop there. In a move that was crucial for the future of Western thought, the Irish monks also copied the great works of the pagan, classical world. While monasteries on the continent were sometimes ambivalent or even hostile to these pre-Christian texts, the Irish, having never been part of the Roman Empire, seemed to possess a unique intellectual curiosity, free from the anxiety of a direct pagan past. And so, in the scriptoria of Clonard and Bangor, scribes diligently copied the poetry of Virgil and Horace, the comedies of Terence, and the histories of Livy. They preserved the essential tools of classical learning, the grammars of Donatus and Priscian, which were the foundation of all education, and the works on rhetoric and philosophy that had been the bedrock of the Roman educational system. They did not see this as a contradiction. To them, these pagan authors were masters of the Latin language, the sacred language of the Church. To understand Latin grammar and rhetoric was to better understand the subtleties of the Scriptures. They believed that all truth was ultimately God's truth, and that even in the works of pagans, there were echoes of wisdom and beauty that could be harnessed for a Christian purpose. In preserving these texts, they were building an intellectual ark, carrying the essential cargo of an entire civilization across the dark waters of a chaotic age. But the Irish scribes did more than just copy. They transformed the book into an object of breathtaking beauty and profound theological meaning through the art of illumination. This was where the soul of Celtic art, with its ancient traditions of abstraction and intricate patterning, fused with the Christian message to create something entirely new. Rather than the realistic, figurative art popular in the Mediterranean world, the Irish monks perfected a style that was complex, symbolic, and deeply contemplative. They filled the pages of their sacred books with an astonishing vocabulary of design. There was the intricate, endless knotwork or interlace, its threads weaving over and under in a continuous line, a symbol of eternity and the interconnectedness of all creation. There were mesmerizing spirals, triskelies and swirling vortices of colour that seemed to draw the eye inwards, towards a point of spiritual focus. and there was the vibrant, playful use of zoomorphic designs, where the forms of animals, dogs, birds, lions, snakes, were elongated, contorted, and woven into the very fabric of the decoration. The bodies of these creatures would twist to form the initial letter of a word, or their mouths would spew forth a cascade of abstract ornament. This was not mere decoration. For the monk who created it, and for the one who contemplated it, this art was a form of visual prayer, a visio divina. To trace the path of an interlace with one's eye was a meditative act, a way of getting lost in the complexity of God's creation in order to find the clarity of his divine order. This artistic genius finds its ultimate expression in the manuscript that is often called the most beautiful book in the world, the Book of Kells. Created around the year 800, likely begun on the island of Iona, and finished in Kells after the monks fled from Viking raids, it is a copy of the four Gospels. But to call it a copy is to utterly miss the point. It is a shrine to the Word of God, made of ink and vellum. Almost every page has some form of decoration, but certain pages are so dense with ornament that they are known as carpet pages, resembling the intricate patterns of an oriental rug. The text itself is almost a secondary consideration, a pretext for an explosion of artistic devotion. Consider the most famous of its pages, the Chi-Rho page, which presents the first two letters of Christ's name in Greek. Here, the letters themselves are almost completely subsumed by a dizzying microscopic web of spirals, knots, and hidden figures. At the end of the letter Rho, a human head appears. Tucked into the whorls are angels, cats watching mice, and even an otter catching a fish. It is a vision of the entire cosmos, from the divine to the mundane, contained within the name of Christ. The level of detail is staggering. Modern analysis has revealed linework so fine that it could only have been executed with a single hair brush, under magnification. It is work that defies easy comprehension, demanding that the viewer slow down, look closer, and become lost in its sacred complexity. The Book of Kells is the masterpiece of a culture that believed that the highest beauty man could create was the only fitting tribute to the divine word. This profound respect for learning was not confined to the scriptorium. The great Irish monasteries became the premier educational institutions of their time, the universities of the Dark Ages. They established schools that drew students not only from all over Ireland, but also from Anglo-Saxon England and the Frankish kingdoms of the continent. The curriculum was based on the classical model of the 7 liberal arts, divided into the trivium and the quadrivium. The trivium, the foundation of learning, consisted of grammar, the study of Latin, logic, the art of reasoning, and rhetoric, the art of persuasive speaking and writing. Once a student had mastered these language arts, he could proceed to the quadrivium, the mathematical arts, arithmetic, geometry, music, understood as the mathematical theory of harmony, and astronomy. The Irish schools were particularly renowned for their study of languages. Latin was the language of the church, and of all learning, and Irish masters were famous for their sophisticated, if sometimes eccentric, command of the language. More remarkably, they preserved the study of Greek at a time when knowledge of it had almost completely vanished in Western Europe. This allowed them to read the scriptures and the church fathers in their original language, giving their scholarship a depth and nuance that was unmatched. There is even evidence that some Irish monks had a working knowledge of Hebrew. This intellectual vibrancy created a culture where learning was not just a practical tool, but a path to understanding God, and the monasteries that housed these schools became beacons of light in a darkening world. This reverence for knowledge was not something the Irish monks kept to themselves. Fueled by the ideal of white martyrdom, the Peregrinatio pro Christo, they became the greatest missionaries of the age. They saw exile not just as a personal sacrifice, but as a divine commission to spread the gospel and establish new centres of faith and learning abroad. The most famous of these early spiritual adventurers was Colum Cille, or Columba, a prince of the powerful Uí Néill dynasty. He left Ireland around the year 563 and founded a monastery on the tiny windswept island of Iona, off the western coast of Scotland. From this remote but strategically important base, Columba and his monks began the conversion of the Picts of Scotland and the Anglo-Saxons of northern England. Iona became a new spiritual capital, a daughter house that would soon rival the great monasteries of Ireland itself in fame and influence. A generation later, another Irish monk, the fiery and uncompromising Columbanus, embarked on an even more ambitious journey. He and 12 companions left Ireland around 590 and travelled through the fractured semi-pagan kingdoms of Merovingian Gaul, what is now France. Columbanus was a force of nature, a man of immense learning and fierce ascetic discipline who did not hesitate to rebuke kings and queens for their immorality. He founded a series of influential monasteries, most notably Luxeuil in France and Bobbio in northern Italy. These foundations followed the strict Irish rule, with its emphasis on harsh penance, private confession, and the authority of the abbot. They became new hubs of scholarship, stocked with manuscripts brought from Ireland, and their influence spread throughout the Frankish world, inspiring a renewal of monastic life. The disciples of Columbanus and other Irish peregrini fanned out across the continent. St. Gall travelled into what is now Switzerland and founded the monastery that still bears his name. St. Kilian became the apostle to the Franks in the region of Würzburg in Germany. Everywhere they went, they brought their books, their unique artistic style, their advanced scholarship, and their distinct form of Christian practice. They were intellectual Johnny Appleseeds, planting monasteries that would grow into great centres of learning and culture, reintroducing classical knowledge and a vibrant spiritual fervour to a Europe that desperately needed both. This outward explosion of Irish intellectual and spiritual energy was one of the key forces that helped to shape the future of the continent. One of the most distinctive and influential exports of the Irish monks was a unique set of texts known as the penitentials. These were, in essence, detailed handbooks for confessors. In the early church, confession was often a public and dramatic affair, reserved for the most serious of sins and often only allowed once in a lifetime. The Irish, however, developed a system of private confession, where a penitent would confess his sins to a priest, who would act as an anam cara, or soul friend. The penitentials were manuals designed to guide the priest in this role. They contained exhaustive lists of every sin imaginable, from the most trivial to the most severe, and for each sin, a specific penance, or tariff, was prescribed. These texts provide an incredible window into the mindset and anxieties of the early medieval world. They detail penances for theft, murder and violence, but also for greed, lustful thoughts, gossip, and even for falling asleep during prayers. The penances were often severe, involving long periods of fasting on bread and water, reciting hundreds of psalms while holding one's arms outstretched in the form of a cross vigil, or even exile from one's home for a number of years. This system, with its focus on the individual's conscience and the possibility of regular forgiveness and spiritual healing, was revolutionary. As Irish monks travelled across Europe, they took their penitentials with them, and this practice of private confession and prescribed penance gradually became the standard model for the entire Western Church, a legacy that endures to this day. The life that produced this incredible cultural flowering was one of profound physical and spiritual hardship. The Irish monks were athletes of the soul, and they practiced a form of asceticism that was famously, even notoriously, severe. Their goal was to subdue the body and its desires in order to liberate the spirit for contemplation of God. Fasting was a constant practice. Monks would regularly abstain from food for 1 or more days, and even on days when they ate, the diet was meagre. They embraced physical discomfort as a spiritual tool. They wore rough, undyed wool habits that would chafe the skin. They slept on bare stone slabs or thin pallets of straw. The practice of the vigil, staying, awake through the night in prayer, was common. An even more extreme form of penance involved immersion in freezing cold water, a river, a lake, or the ocean itself, while reciting the entire Psalter. This was seen as a way to quench the fires of lust and to discipline the rebellious flesh. This was the green martyrdom, the daily bloodless battle against the self. To the modern mind, it can seem like a form of self-punishment born of a hatred for the body. But for the monks, it was a vital part of their spiritual training, a way to gain mastery over their own weaknesses and to imitate, in a small way, the sufferings of Christ and the early martyrs of the Church. It was this intense, focused discipline that forged the spiritual steel required for their extraordinary achievements. For centuries, this monastic civilization flourished, a network of luminous points in a dark world. But the very success and wealth of these communities would eventually make them a target. The world they had tried to keep at bay with their stone walls began to encroach, and it came not with theological arguments, but with the axe and the sword. In the year 793, a terrifying new force appeared off the coast of northern England. Raiders from Scandinavia, the Vikings, sacked the great monastery of Lindisfarne, an offshoot of Iona and a jewel of the Irish Christian tradition. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the horror. The ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne, with plunder and slaughter. It was a grim prelude to what was to come. Soon the Viking longships, with their dragon-proud heads and shallow draughts, were slicing through the waters of the Irish Sea. Iona itself was raided repeatedly, and then they came to Ireland. The monasteries, often located on coasts or navigable rivers, were the perfect targets. They were not only centres of population, but were also by this point immensely wealthy. Over generations, they had been gifted vast tracts of land by pious chieftains. Their workshops produced beautiful and valuable metalwork, chalices, crosses, and book shrines made of silver and gold, studded with precious gems. And they were, for the most part, undefended. They were soft, rich targets for raiders who had no respect for their sacred status. A Viking raid would have been an experience of unimaginable terror. The first sign might be the watchman in the round tower, frantically ringing the bell as he spotted the ships on the horizon. Panic would erupt. The monks would rush to gather the most precious treasures, the illuminated Gospels, the relics of the founding saint, the gold chalices, and carry them up the narrow stone stairs of the round tower, securing the high, heavy oak door behind them. The rest of the community could only hide or pray. The Vikings were swift and utterly ruthless. They swarmed over the vallum, killing anyone who stood in their way. Monks who had dedicated their lives to peace were cut down in their own chapels, becoming true red martyrs. The raiders plundered the monastery for anything of value, stripping the altars, breaking open chests and taking captives to be sold as slaves. They set fire to the timber buildings, the library with its irreplaceable books turning to ash. Then, as quickly as they had come, they were gone, leaving behind a scene of smouldering ruins, desecration, and death. This onslaught, which lasted for over 2 centuries, had a profound and lasting effect. Some monasteries were abandoned completely, the jungle of the Irish wilderness beginning its slow and patient work of reclamation. Others survived, but were forever changed. They became more fortified, more worldly, their abbots as much warlords as they were spiritual fathers. The round towers, which had been built primarily as bell towers, now proved their worth as defensive structures, and many more were built during this period. The age of Viking terror marked the beginning of the end for the golden age of Irish monasticism. The confidence, the outward-looking missionary zeal, was replaced by a more fearful, defensive posture. The world had come crashing through the gates. The Viking threat was not the only challenge. The very strength of the monastic system contained the seeds of its own decay. As the great monasteries grew in wealth and land, they became powerful political players. The position of abbot became a coveted prize, often held by members of the same powerful local dynasty for generations. This created a new class of abbot, who was often a layman, a political chieftain who controlled the monastery's assets and army, while a prior handled the day-to-day spiritual affairs. These great monastic cities began to behave like the secular kingdoms around them. They engaged in political alliances, and shockingly, they even went to war with one another. The Annals of the Four Masters, a medieval Irish chronicle, records numerous instances of rival monasteries raising armies and battling each other, resulting in hundreds of casualties. The pure ascetic ideal of the early founders was being suffocated by the worldly realities of wealth and power. At the same time, a slow but inexorable pressure for reform was building from outside. The Irish Church, with its unique customs and its fiercely independent abbot-led monasteries, had long been out of step with the rest of Western Christendom. which was becoming increasingly centralised under the authority of the Pope in Rome. A key point of contention was the date of Easter. The Irish calculated it using an older Celtic system, while the Roman Church used a more updated calculation. This meant that at a court like that of the Anglo-Saxon King of Northumbria, where the king followed the Roman custom and his Irish-educated queen followed the Celtic one, half the court could be celebrating Easter, while the other half was still observing the Lenten fast. Another difference was the monastic tonsure, the ritual haircut for monks. Irish monks shaved the front of their head from ear to ear, while Roman monks shaved the crown. These might seem like trivial matters, but they represented a profound clash of cultures and authority. The issue came to a head at the Synod of Whitby in 664, held in the Kingdom of Northumbria. After hearing arguments from both the Celtic and Roman parties, the king decided in favour of the Roman customs. This was a pivotal moment. While the effects were not immediate, it marked the beginning of the long, slow decline of the influence of the Celtic Church, even within Ireland itself. Over the following centuries, a series of church councils and reforms gradually brought the Irish Church into line with Roman practice. The unique, chaotic and vibrant system of monastic city-states began to be replaced by a more orderly, parish-based diocesan structure, with bishops, rather than abbots, as the primary leaders. The final transformation came with the arrival of new monastic orders from the continent in the 12th century. The Cistercians, the Augustinians and others brought with them the standardised rules and architectural styles that were common across Europe. They founded magnificent new abbeys, like Mellifont and Jerpoint, with their grand Romanesque and Gothic churches, their formal cloisters, and their centrally organised structures. These new orders were often actively supported by Irish kings and reformers who saw them as a way to modernise the Irish Church. Many of the old Celtic monasteries were either abandoned or were taken over and rebuilt by these new orders. The ancient, uniquely Irish expression of monastic life, which had burned so brightly for so long, was slowly being absorbed into the European mainstream. The final blow to the old Gaelic world that had nurtured this monastic culture was the Anglo-Norman invasion, which began in 1169. This event marked a fundamental rupture in Irish history. The old system of petty kingdoms, Brehon law and clan-based society was gradually replaced by a feudal system imposed by the new English lords. The patrons of the old monasteries were dispossessed, their lands granted to Norman knights. While many of the new continental-style abbeys flourished under Anglo-Norman patronage, the specifically Gaelic monastic tradition, with its deep roots in the native culture, entered its final decline. The world that had created Skellig Michael and the Book of Kells was passing away, leaving behind only magnificent ruins and the echoes of its former glory. To walk through the ruins of a great Irish monastery today is to experience a profound and melancholic beauty. At Glendalough, you can wander through an entire monastic city. The great round tower still stands sentinel over the valley. The shell of the cathedral, rebuilt and expanded over the centuries, hints at the site's former importance. But it is in the smaller, older structures that the spirit of the place feels most alive. St. Kevin's Church, with its stone roof and tiny belfry, feels ancient and solid. You can feel the cold stone of the walls, see the light filtering through the narrow windows, and almost hear the faint echo of a psalm carried on the wind that whispers down from the Wicklow Mountains. The past feels tangible here, a beautiful sadness for what has been lost. Or to make the pilgrimage to Clonmacnoise, on the gentle banks of the River Shannon, is to stand at what was once the crossroads of Ireland. Here, a vast complex of churches, high crosses and round towers speaks of a community that was a centre of religion, art, trade and learning for centuries. The high crosses, like the magnificent cross of the Scriptures, are sermons carved in stone, their panels depicting biblical scenes with a distinctively Irish artistic flair. They stand now as weathered, lichen-covered testaments to a faith and artistry that sought to make the landscape itself a sacred text. Standing there as the river flows slowly past, just as it has for millennia, you feel the immense weight of the history that has soaked into this patch of earth. The most potent survivors of this lost world, however, are not made of stone but of ink and animal skin. They are the manuscripts. To see the Book of Kells in person, displayed in the hushed, dark treasury of Trinity College Dublin, is an almost overwhelming experience. No photograph or reproduction can capture the luminosity of the colours, the sheer energy and life that seems to pulse from its pages after 1200 years. You are looking at the patient, prayerful work of men whose names are lost to history but whose genius is laid bare. It is a direct, unbroken link to their world. You can see the individual brushstrokes, the slight imperfections, the sheer, audacious ambition of it all. These books are not just historical artefacts. They are the living soul of Irish monasticism, the tangible proof of their devotion, their learning, and their world-class artistry. They are the treasures that the monks in the Round Towers died to protect. The intellectual heritage these monks preserved and transmitted is woven into the very fabric of Western civilization. When the Emperor Charlemagne sought to bring about a renaissance of learning in his vast European empire at the beginning of the 9th century, he turned to the scholars of the Celtic world. Men like the Irish scholar Clement and the Anglo-Saxon Alcuin of York, who was a product of the Irish-influenced Northumbrian schools, became the architects of the Carolingian Renaissance. They established schools, standardized scripts, and reintroduced the systematic study of the liberal arts, using the very texts that Irish monks had been dutifully copying for centuries. The knowledge that had been sheltered in the remote sanctuaries of Ireland flowed back into the continental mainstream, providing the essential fuel for the intellectual reawakening of Europe. The thread of classical learning stretched thin, and almost to the breaking point had been held safe in their hands, and so we are left with the final beautiful paradox: a society of men who sought above all else to renounce the world. They chose exile, silence, and hardship. They built their communities on the edge of the map, on barren islands and in lonely valleys, turning their backs on the chaos of secular affairs. Their focus was entirely on the next world, on the salvation of their own souls and the glory of God. Yet, in doing so, they performed one of the greatest services imaginable to this world. In their quiet scriptoria, lit by a single candle against the encroaching darkness, they preserved the memory of a civilization. They copied not only the sacred words of their own faith, but the poetry, the history, and the philosophy of the pagan world they had supplanted. In seeking to escape from history, they became its most crucial guardians. The quiet, disciplined life of the Irish monk, a life of prayer and work, of beauty and hardship, left an echo that would resonate through the centuries, shaping the world we inhabit today in ways we can scarcely comprehend. To truly grasp the monk's world, we must delve deeper into the very soil from which it sprang. Pre-Christian Ireland was not a primitive wilderness. It was a highly structured, if non-literate, society. The Tuath was the basic political unit, a small kingdom encompassing a few thousand people, and there were perhaps 150 such kingdoms across the island. The Rí or king was not an absolute monarch, but more of a tribal chieftain, whose primary roles were to lead his people in war and to preside over important assemblies. His authority was personal, not territorial, and was sustained by his ability to dispense justice and, crucially, to be generous to his followers. This created a world of constant shifting alliances, of cattle raids that were as much a sport and a display of prowess as they were acts of economic warfare, and a deep-seated loyalty to one's kin group. This social structure directly shaped the form of the Irish Church. When a powerful saint like Colum Cille or Ciaran founded a monastery, it often became intimately associated with his own kin group. The abbacy would frequently pass to a relative of the founder, a practice that ensured the monastery's lands and wealth remained under the control of the ruling family of that Tuath. This made the monastery not just a spiritual centre, but a major political and economic asset for the clan. The Comharba, or heir of the founding saint, the abbot, was therefore a figure of immense prestige. This system explains the fierce independence of the Irish monasteries. They were not units in a tidy hierarchical pyramid reporting to a distant bishop or pope. They were spiritual dynasties, deeply embedded in the secular power structures of Gaelic Ireland. Let us return to the moment of conversion and the genius of Patrick's approach. He did not arrive with a fully formed, rigid theology and a book of rules. He brought a story, a powerful narrative of sacrifice, redemption, and eternal life that resonated in unexpected ways with the existing pagan worldview. The Celts already had a rich mythology of heroes who sacrificed themselves for their people, and a belief in the other world, a realm of the supernatural that was always close at hand. Christianity offered a new, universal framework for these concepts. The self-sacrificing hero was now Christ. The other world was now heaven. The Christian saints, with their miraculous powers and their intimate connection to the divine, could be seen as a new and even more powerful kind of spiritual hero, replacing the old gods and goddesses as the supernatural patrons of the people. The story of St. Brigid of Kildare perfectly illustrates this process of syncretism. Brigid was one of the most beloved of the Irish saints, second only to Patrick. But many scholars believe that her cult was deliberately grafted onto the pre-existing cult of a powerful pagan goddess of the same name, Brigid, who was associated with poetry, healing, and smithcraft. The saint's feast day, February 1st, falls on the same day as the old pagan festival of Imbolc, which marked the beginning of spring. Many of the miracles and attributes associated with St. Brigid have clear pagan antecedents. This was not a deception. It was a brilliant act of cultural translation, allowing the new faith to feel familiar and deeply rooted in the Irish soil from its very inception. This unique genesis fostered an equally unique spiritual psychology. The Irish monastic tradition developed a profound appreciation for the natural world. While some Christian traditions saw nature as fallen and corrupt, the Irish monks saw it as a second scripture, a book filled with the glory and majesty of its creator. There is a whole genre of early Irish poetry, written by monks, that celebrates this connection. In these poems, the writer is often a hermit, living in a small hut in the woods. He finds joy in the simple things, the song of the blackbird, the stag bellowing on the mountainside, the sound of the wind in the trees. These are not seen as distractions from God, but as paths to Him. The beauty of creation was a constant source of spiritual refreshment and a reminder of the divine artist who made it all. A 9th century poem, attributed to an anonymous monk, perfectly captures this sentiment. I have a hut in the wood, none knows it but my lord. An ash tree this side, a hazel on the other, a great tree of branching oak encompasses it. The voice of the wind against the branchy wood, grey with cloud, cascades of the river, the swan's song, beautiful music. This intimate, loving attention to the details of the natural world is the same impulse that led the illuminators of the Book of Kells to hide perfectly rendered images of moths, birds, and animals within the sacred text. For them, there was no sharp division between the sacred and the secular, the Word of God and the world of God. All was part of a single, unified and miraculous creation. Let us now imagine the life of a single monk, whom we will call Brother Aidan, from his first day to his last. Perhaps he was a boy of 7 or 8 when he was first brought to the monastery. This was a common practice, known as oblation. He might have been a younger son given by his noble family to the church to forge a powerful spiritual alliance, or perhaps an orphan taken in by the community. For young Aidan, the monastery would be the only family and home he would ever truly know. His first years would be spent in the monastic school, under the stern but caring eye of the master. His world would shrink to the size of the vallum, and his days would be filled with learning. His first and most difficult task would be to learn Latin. This was the key that unlocked every other door of knowledge. He would spend countless hours memorizing the declensions of nouns and the conjugations of verbs, chanting them aloud until they became second nature. He would learn to read using a psalter, the Book of Psalms, the foundational text of monastic prayer. His teacher would point to the strange, rounded letters of the insular script, and slowly the black marks on the vellum would begin to resolve themselves into words, then into sentences, then into the beautiful soaring poetry of David's prayers. This was a magical moment, the opening of a new universe. Alongside Latin, he would be instructed in the art of music, specifically the plainchant that was used in the daily liturgy. He had to learn hundreds of psalms and hymns by heart, mastering the subtle melodic contours of the chants. His young voice would join the deeper voices of the older monks in the oratory, becoming one strand in a single, unified chorus of praise. This was not music for entertainment. It was a form of prayer that was believed to be more powerful, more pleasing to God than the spoken word alone. It was the sound that filled the monastery, the auditory expression of its entire purpose. As Aidan grew older and demonstrated an aptitude for learning and a steady hand, he might be chosen for the highest of callings within the monastery, to become a scribe in the scriptorium. This would be a great honour. He would be apprenticed to a master scribe, who would first teach him the ancillary crafts. He would learn how to select the perfect goose feathers and carve them into quills. He would learn the secrets of making ink, of mixing the crushed oak galls with vitriol and gum arabic, testing its consistency until it was just right. Most importantly, he would learn the arduous process of preparing vellum, the back-breaking work of scraping and stretching the skins until they were as smooth and white as polished ivory. Only after mastering these skills would he be allowed to write. He would start with simple exercises, copying out letters and words on scraps of vellum, learning to form the perfect rounded half-unseals and the swifter, more angular minuscules. The master scribe would be a demanding critic, pointing out any inconsistency in the height of the letters, any wavering in the lines. Aidan's hand would ache, his back would seize up and his eyes would burn in the dim light. But slowly, over months and years, his hand would become sure and steady. His script would become as regular and as beautiful as that of his master. He would have learned the discipline of the pen. Finally, the day would come when he was deemed ready to work on a true codex. The abbot might commission a new copy of the Four Gospels, a text that was desperately needed by a daughter house being founded in the Pictish lands. This would be the work of a lifetime, or at least of many years. The project would involve a whole team. Some monks would be responsible solely for preparing the vast quantity of vellum required. Others, the master scribes like Aidan, would be tasked with writing the main body of the text, the black letter work. And a select few, the true artists known as illuminators, would be responsible for the magnificent decorated pages. Aidan might spend a decade of his life on this single book. Day after day he would enter the scriptorium, take his place at his slanted desk, and continue his slow, meticulous work. He would copy from an older exemplar, perhaps a book brought back from Rome, or a copy of a famous manuscript from another Irish house. His work required absolute concentration. A momentary lapse could lead to a skipped line or a misspelled word, a terrible error that would mar the sacred text. If he did make a mistake, he would have to carefully take his penknife and scrape the ink from the surface of the vellum, a delicate and nerve-wracking process, before attempting to correct it. As he worked, he was not just copying letters, he was absorbing the text into his very being. The words of the evangelists would become a part of him. He would live inside the stories of Christ's life, death, and resurrection. His work was a form of deep, prolonged meditation on the scriptures. He would feel the weight of his responsibility. This book, the product of his hands, would be the most sacred object in the new monastery. It would be used in the Mass, its words would bring comfort to the dying, and its very presence would be seen as a source of miraculous power and protection for the community. Aidan was not just making a book, he was creating a holy relic. Perhaps, as a senior and respected scribe, Aidan would be allowed to contribute to the illumination. He might be tasked with creating an initial, a large decorated letter at the beginning of a chapter. He would lay down the faint design with a lead point, a complex pattern of interlace and spirals. Then, with a brush made from the finest marten hair, he would begin to apply the colours. He would lay down a base of gesso, a plaster-like substance if he intended to apply gold leaf. Then, with painstaking precision, he would fill in the intricate patterns with vibrant mineral pigments, the deep red of lead oxide, the brilliant yellow of orpiment, the earthy green of malachite. Each colour was precious, each brushstroke a prayer. This was the work that transformed a text into a treasure. Now let us imagine a different path for a monk, one not of the mind but of the body. Brother Finian was not a scholar. He came to the monastery as a grown man, a farmer who had lost his family to plague and his land to a rival clan. He sought not learning, but solace, and a life of purpose. He would become a lay brother, his days defined by the principle of labora. He would rise before dawn with the choir monks, but after attending Lauds, His path would lead not to the scriptorium, but to the fields. His prayers would be offered through the sweat of his brow and the strength of his back. In the spring he would guide the heavy ox-drawn plough, his hands calloused from the wood, his feet sinking into the cold, damp earth. He would walk the furrows, scattering the seeds of barley and oats that would become the community's bread and ale. In the summer, he would work under the long sun, tending the monastery's vast herds of cattle, its primary source of wealth, and protecting them from wolves and raiders. He would fish in the river, skillfully casting a net to bring in a catch of salmon that would feed the entire community. He knew the land, its rhythms, its moods. He could read the sky for signs of rain, and he knew which fields were best for which crops. His knowledge was practical, ancient, and essential. Finian might also be a skilled craftsman. He might work in the monastery's forge, the air filled with the roar of the bellows, the clang of hammer on anvil, and the hiss of hot metal quenched in water. Here, he would forge and repair the essential tools of the community: ploughshares, axes, knives, and nails. Or he might work with wood, shaping the timbers for a new roof on the guest house, or carving a simple wooden cross. This physical work was seen as a vital and honourable part of the monastic life. It was a direct participation in the act of creation, of bringing order and sustenance from the raw materials of the earth. It was a way of serving God that was as valid and as holy as the scribes' copying of the Gospels. The monastery was also a centre of healing. Let us consider Brother Dare, who worked in the infirmary. He would have a deep knowledge of herbal medicine, much of it inherited from pre-Christian traditions. The monastery would have a physic garden where he cultivated a wide range of medicinal plants: comfrey for setting bones, yarrow to staunch the flow of blood, willow bark as a pain reliever, and chamomile to soothe a fever. Dare would be responsible for caring for the sick and elderly monks within the community, but his skills would also be sought by the lay, people from the surrounding countryside. In an age with no professional doctors, the monastic infirmera was often the only source of medical knowledge and care for miles around. He would set broken limbs, stitch wounds, and mix potions and salves, all the while offering prayers for the patient's spiritual as well as physical well-being. Life within the monastery was not always one of quiet harmony. It was a community of human beings, with all their inherent frailties. There would have been personality clashes, jealousies, and struggles for influence. The strict rule of the abbot was designed to manage these tensions. Any act of disobedience or dissent was a serious offence, a threat to the spiritual health of the entire community. The penitentials give us a glimpse into the kinds of problems that could arise: monks arguing with one another, refusing to perform their assigned work, or speaking with pride about their own accomplishments. The prescribed penances, extra prayers, fasting, sometimes even corporal punishment, were designed to swiftly correct such behaviour and restore the harmony of the community. The abbot himself was the linchpin of this entire world. He was the father figure, the spiritual guide, the chief administrator, and the final arbiter of all disputes. A great abbot, like Ciaran of Clonmacnoise or Comgall of Bangor, was a man of immense spiritual charisma and practical wisdom. He had to be a theologian, a manager, a diplomat, and sometimes even a military strategist. He managed the monastery's vast agricultural estates, oversaw its scriptorium and its workshops, negotiated with local kings, and provided spiritual direction to hundreds of monks. His authority was nearly absolute, but it was meant to be exercised with humility and love. The health and success of a monastery depended more than anything else on the quality of its abbot. A wise abbot could turn a small foundation into a beacon of learning, while a weak or corrupt one could bring a great house to ruin. Let us now follow one of our monks, Brother Coleman, on a journey beyond the monastery walls. He is a peregrinus, one of the white martyrs who has chosen a life of exile for Christ. He is not a founder like Columbanus, but a scholar, travelling to one of the great Irish-founded monasteries on the continent, perhaps St. Gall in what is now Switzerland. The journey itself would be a perilous undertaking. He and a few companions would first have to make their way to the coast, perhaps travelling with merchants or under the protection of a friendly chieftain. They would then have to secure passage on a trading vessel, a simple hide-covered boat, or a more sturdy wooden ship, across the treacherous Irish Sea to Britain or Gaul. Once on the continent, their journey would continue for weeks or months, mostly on foot. They would travel through a fragmented and often dangerous landscape, following the old Roman roads where they still existed, or navigating by rivers and landmarks. They would be vulnerable to bandits and suspicious local lords. At night, they would seek shelter in other monasteries or rely on the charity of strangers. Coleman would carry with him the most precious cargo imaginable: books. Strapped to his back in a leather satchel would be a few carefully chosen manuscripts from his home monastery's library, a copy of the Gospels, a psalter, perhaps a volume of the writings of the Church Fathers, and a Latin grammar. These books were his credentials, his tools, and his gift to the house he was journeying to. Upon arriving at St. Gall, Coleman would be welcomed into a community that felt both familiar and foreign. The monastic rule would be similar to the one he had followed in Ireland. He would recognise the structure of the divine office, the emphasis on asceticism, and the reverence for learning. He might even find other Irish monks there. But he would also be in a new world. He would hear the strange dialects of the local Alemannic German people, and he would be part of a community that was a key player in the politics of the vast Carolingian Empire. His skills as a scribe and a scholar of Greek would be highly prized. He would be put to work in the scriptorium, teaching the local monks the intricacies of insular script and illumination, or helping to translate Greek texts. Monks like Coleman were the living threads that wove the intellectual and spiritual fabric of Europe together. They were the bees of the medieval world, travelling from flower to flower, from one monastic centre to another, cross-pollinating ideas, artistic styles, and knowledge. The books they carried were the precious pollen. A manuscript written in Bangor, Ireland, could be carried to St. Gall, where it would be copied. That copy might then be taken to a monastery in Germany, where it would influence the local script and artistic tradition. This constant movement of scholars and their books created a vibrant pan-European intellectual network, a republic of letters, with its major arteries flowing out of Ireland. This is how the learning of one small island on the edge of the world came to reseed an entire continent. Let us now turn our gaze back to Ireland and confront the storm. The arrival of the Vikings in the late 8th and early 9th centuries was not just a military crisis. It was a profound psychological and theological shock. The monk's world was built on the idea of the monastery as a sacred sanctuary, a space protected by the power of God and its founding saint. The brutal, sacrilegious violence of the pagan Northmen shattered this sense of security. How could God allow his holy places to be desecrated, his servants slaughtered, and his sacred treasures plundered by heathens? It was a crisis of faith that must have shaken the communities to their core. The response was not just one of prayer, but also of practical adaptation. The construction of round towers accelerated dramatically during this period. We can imagine the scene. After a raid, the survivors gather amidst the ruins of their timber church and library. The abbot makes a decision. They will rebuild, but this time they will build for survival. A master mason is brought in. For years, the community's labour is directed towards this new project. They quarry the stone, haul it to the site, and under the mason's direction they begin to build. The tower rises slowly, course by course of meticulously fitted stone. It is a massive undertaking, a huge investment of the monastery's resources, but it is seen as essential. It is a defiant statement in stone, a symbol of resilience, a finger pointed at heaven, a refuge against the terrors of the world. The Vikings also changed the Irish landscape in another way. They were not just raiders, they were also traders and settlers. They founded Ireland's first true towns at the mouths of its major rivers: Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, Limerick. These fortified port towns became major hubs in the vast Viking trading network that stretched from Iceland to Constantinople. This created a new dynamic. The monasteries now had to contend with powerful, urbanized neighbours. Sometimes this led to conflict, but it also led to trade and cultural exchange. The Irish learned new shipbuilding techniques and military strategies from the Vikings, and the Vikings, over time, began to adopt Christianity. This process of assimilation, of the Vikings becoming the Norse Gaels, gradually reduced the threat, but the world had been irrevocably changed. The isolated, inward-looking nature of the early monasteries was gone forever. Now we must consider the internal pressures, the slow erosion of the original ideal. As a monastery like Clonmacnois grew, it became a victim of its own success. By the 10th century, it was not just a monastery, it was a city. It had a large lay population of tenants, craftsmen and servants living under its jurisdiction. It had vast land holdings, multiple churches and enormous wealth. The abbot was a great lord, a prince of the church. This inevitably led to worldly entanglements. The monastery had to defend its lands and its prerogatives, which meant engaging in politics and sometimes in war. The annals record a battle in 944 between the monasteries of Clonmacnois and Roscrea, a stark illustration of how far some communities had strayed from the peaceful ideals of their founders. This drift towards secularization was accelerated by the increasing control of abbesses by powerful families. For a ruling dynasty, controlling a major monastery was like controlling a strategic fortress or a wealthy province. It gave them access to land, money, and a ready supply of armed men from the monastery's tenants. This led to abuses, with abbots who were warriors first and churchmen second, if at all. It is this context of internal decay and external pressure that fueled the great 12th century reform movement in the Irish Church. Figures like St. Malachy saw the old Celtic monastic system as corrupt and hopelessly provincial. They looked to Europe, to Rome, and to the new disciplined orders like the Cistercians as the model for the future. The arrival of the Cistercians at Mellifont in 1142 was a revolution. They brought with them a new, pan-European aesthetic, Gothic architecture, with its pointed arches and ribbed vaults. They brought a new, highly centralised organisational structure where every house was subject to visitation and correction from its mother house, and they brought a different ethos, one that emphasised manual labour for all monks and a strict uniform interpretation of the rule of St. Benedict. They were efficient, they were organised, and they were the cutting edge of European monasticism. The old Irish foundations, with their sprawling chaotic layouts and their idiosyncratic customs, suddenly looked antiquated. Many were reformed along these new lines, their old identities and traditions subsumed into a new international order. The flame of Celtic monasticism was not extinguished, but its uniquely Irish character was being diluted. The Anglo-Norman invasion completed this process. The new lords established their own monasteries, overwhelmingly favouring the continental orders. They built magnificent abbeys like Tintern Abbey and Graig-y-Namanog, which were culturally and architecturally English or French, not Irish. These new foundations were often granted the lands of older Gaelic monasteries, which were suppressed. The invasion created two distinct cultural and ecclesiastical worlds in Ireland: the Anglo-Norman sphere, which was aligned with England and Rome, and the Gaelic sphere, which was pushed back into the wilder, less accessible parts of the island. While some Gaelic monasteries survived in these areas, their golden age was over. They were no longer at the centre of European learning, but on its periphery. The engine of their cultural production, the scriptorium, slowed down, and the great age of manuscript illumination came to an end. And so, the story circles back to the ruins. When we look at the remains of a place like Monaster Boyce, with its magnificent high crosses and its elegant round tower, we are seeing the product of that first, brilliant flowering of the Gaelic Christian imagination. When we then visit a Cistercian abbey like Jerpoint, with its soaring church and its beautifully carved cloister, we are seeing the product of the European reform movement that ultimately replaced it. Each is beautiful in its own way, but they speak of two different worlds. The first is the world of the independent, charismatic saint, of the tuath, of the epic poems and the wild, untamed landscape. The second is the world of centralised authority, of feudalism, of a universal Christian culture that stretched from Italy to Ireland. The history of medieval Ireland is written in the stones of these two different kinds of ruin. Let us explore in greater detail the sensory experience of this world. What did it sound like, feel like, smell like? The dominant sound, the acoustic backdrop to all of life, was the bell, not the deep resonant toll of a massive cast bell in a continental cathedral, but the higher, clearer, more insistent clang of a handbell, often made of sheet iron or bronze. It was the monastery's clock, its voice, its alarm. Its ringing marked the passage of the sacred hours, calling the monks from sleep, from the fields, from their cells. It announced the arrival of a guest, warned of a danger, and tolled for the death of a brother. Its sound imposed a sacred order on the landscape, a human, Christian rhythm laid over the wilder rhythms of nature. Inside the oratory, the primary sound was the human voice, joined in the unison chant of the psalms. The acoustic properties of the small stone building, with its hard, reflective surfaces, would have amplified and blended the voices, creating a powerful, immersive soundscape. It was a sound designed to elevate the soul, to lose the individual voice in the collective prayer of the community. In the silence between the chants, one would hear the rustle of woolen robes, the shuffle of leather shoes on the stone floor, the creak of a wooden bench. These small sounds would have been magnified in the profound quiet, each one taking on a kind of significance. The smells of the monastery would have been rich, earthy, and intense. The ever-present scent of wood smoke from the kitchen and the hearths would have mingled with the smell of damp earth and stone. In the refectory, the aroma of baking bread, of simmering oat porridge, and the sharp tang of soured milk or cheese would fill the air. The scriptorium, as we have noted, had its own unique bouquet of ink, vellum, and beeswax. The church would have the sweet, resinous scent of incense used during the Mass, a smell that was meant to evoke the scent of heaven itself. And everywhere there would be the smell of humanity, of unwashed wool and sweat, a constant reminder of the physical reality of the body that the monks sought to discipline. And what of the sense of touch? Life was a constant negotiation with the cold. The stone walls of the cells and the church would radiate a deep, penetrating chill for much of the year. The monk's simple woolen habit would be coarse and scratchy against the skin. His hands would be calloused and rough, whether from the plough, the forge, or the scribe's knife. He would feel the icy shock of the water during ritual ablutions, and the welcome, fleeting warmth of the fire in the common room, the one place where a hearth was often kept burning. The vellum he worked on would have a cool, smooth, almost skin-like texture under his fingers. Touch was a reminder of hardship, of the world of physical sensation that the spiritual life was meant to transcend. The visual world was one of stark contrasts. The dominant colours of the landscape were the endless greens and browns, of the fields and forests, the greys of the stone and the sea, and the often overcast sky. Inside the monastery buildings the world was dark, defined by deep shadows and the occasional shaft of light from a narrow window. This made the moments of intense colour all the more dazzling. The vibrant pigments of an illuminated manuscript would seem to glow with an inner light in the gloom of the library. The flash of gold and silver from the chalice and paten on the altar during Mass would be a breathtaking glimpse of otherworldly splendour. These carefully controlled moments of visual richness were designed to be spiritually potent, to give the monks a foretaste of the beauty of the heavenly kingdom. Let us delve more deeply into the intellectual world of the Irish monk. What did he believe about the cosmos, about history, about his place in the grand scheme of things? His worldview was thoroughly theological. History was not a random series of events, but a divine story, a narrative written by God. It began with creation, saw its turning point in the incarnation of Christ, and was heading towards a definite apocalyptic conclusion, the Last Judgment. The monk saw himself and his community as living in the final age of the world, the saeculum senescens, the aging aeon. Their sacred duty was to keep the faith alive, to pray for the souls of the living and the dead, and to prepare the world for its end. This belief gave their work in the scriptorium an urgent, almost eschatological significance. The world was old and forgetful. The great civilizations of the past had fallen. Knowledge was a fragile, precious thing. By copying the scriptures and the works of the classical past, they were not just engaged in an academic exercise. They were rescuing the essential wisdom of humanity from the wreckage of time. They were building a bulwark against the tide of barbarism and ignorance. Every book they copied was a victory against the forces of darkness and decay. It was a sacred trust, a mission given to them, the people on the very edge of the world by God himself. Their understanding of the natural world was likewise seen through the lens of faith. They were not scientists in the modern sense, but they were keen observers. They compiled calendars, charting the movement of the sun, moon, and stars, not primarily for astronomical purposes, but to correctly calculate the date of Easter. They wrote treatises on the nature of tides and weather patterns. but every natural phenomenon was interpreted for its spiritual meaning. A comet was not a ball of ice and dust, but a sign from God, a portent of plague or the death of a king. A storm was a manifestation of divine power. The world was a book of symbols, and the educated monk was the one who could read its allegorical meaning, discerning the hand of God in all things. The Irish monks also had a particular fascination with geography and the exotic. Living on an island at the furthest extremity of the known world, they were intensely curious about what lay beyond. They read and copied classical geographies, accounts of distant lands like India and Ethiopia. But they also produced their own unique works, like The Voyage of St. Brendan the Navigator, a fantastical tale of a 6th century Irish monk who, according to the legend, sailed the Atlantic with his brethren in a leather boat, encountering magical islands, sea monsters, and even the gates of paradise. While the story is a work of religious allegory, not a historical travelogue, it perfectly captures the adventurous, outward-looking spirit of the Irish peregrini, their willingness to sail into the unknown, trusting entirely in God's providence. This intellectual confidence, this sense of being at the centre of God's plan despite being on the geographical periphery, helps explain the assertive, and sometimes prickly, nature of the Irish Church in its dealings with Rome and others. When the Irish monk Columbanus wrote to the Pope, he did so with great respect, but also as an equal, chiding the papacy for its perceived errors and defending the traditions of his homeland with fierce intellectual rigour. He wrote, "For we are the disciples of Saints Peter and Paul, and of all the disciples who wrote the sacred canon by the Holy Ghost, and we accept nothing outside the evangelical and apostolic teaching." There is a powerful sense of self-assurance here, a belief that the Irish Church, in its purity and its unbroken tradition of learning, had a direct line to the sources of Christian truth. Let's return to the monastery's role as a social and economic hub for the surrounding lay community. The monastery was often the largest and most stable employer in the Stooth. It needed farmers to work its extensive lands, craftsmen to build its structures, and servants to manage its guest house and kitchens. Many lay families would have lived on the monastery's lands as tenants, giving a portion of their produce to the community in exchange for the right to farm the land and the protection of the abbot. This created a complex web of economic and social interdependence. The monastery was not an isolated commune, it was the gravitational centre of its local world. It also functioned as a kind of local government. The abbot, especially if he was from the local ruling family, would often be called upon to arbitrate disputes between lay people. The monastery's sacred status made it a neutral ground, where oaths could be sworn and treaties could be made. The Brehan laws themselves recognised the special status of the church, and the monastery often became the repository for legal knowledge, with monks acting as scribes to record genealogies and legal contracts. The monastery was the bank, the courthouse, and the record office for the entire region. Furthermore, the monastery was the centre of technological innovation. The monks introduced new and more effective farming techniques. The watermill, sersus a crucial invention for grinding grain, was popularised in Ireland through the monasteries. Their metalworkers produced not only beautiful chalices and crosses, but also superior tools and weapons. Their knowledge of stonemasonry, particularly in the construction of arches and mortar-free stone roofs, was far in advance of secular building practices. The monastery was a hub of practical knowledge, a place where the skills necessary to build a more stable and prosperous society were nurtured and disseminated. This deep entanglement with the secular world was both a strength and a weakness. It made the monasteries resilient and powerful, but it also exposed them to the corrupting influences of wealth and politics. The story of their decline is the story of this tension reaching a breaking point. When the ideal of spiritual retreat clashed with the reality of being a major feudal landlord and political player, the spiritual ideal often lost. The 12th century reformers sought to cut this Gordian knot by imposing a stricter separation between the monastic and secular worlds, but in doing so, they also severed the deep roots that had nourished the unique character of Irish monasticism for centuries. Let us take a moment to consider the high crosses in more detail, for they are one of the most eloquent expressions of this entire culture. These were not simply grave markers. They were the great public monuments of their day, the visual Bibles for a largely illiterate population. Standing in the centre of the monastic enclosure, they were a permanent public declaration of faith and a powerful symbol of the monastery's importance. Carved from massive single blocks of sandstone, their creation was a major feat of engineering and artistry. The iconography of the crosses is a masterclass in theological storytelling. The typical arrangement features a large circle enclosing the intersection of the arms and shaft, a distinctive feature of the Celtic cross that may symbolise the cosmos, eternity, or the halo of the risen Christ. The entire surface of the cross is divided into panels, each containing a carved scene. On one side you will typically find scenes from the Old Testament, Adam and Eve, Cain slaying Abel, David with his harp. On the other side, scenes from the New Testament are depicted, the Annunciation, the baptism of Christ, and centrally at the heart of the cross, the crucifixion. The message was clear. The Old Testament prefigures the New. All of history leads to the moment of Christ's sacrifice. But what is fascinating is the way these universal Christian stories are told with a local accent. The figures are often depicted in a style that is more symbolic than realistic. The soldiers at the crucifixion might be shown wearing the gear of Irish warriors. The arrangement of the scenes and the choice of which stories to tell often reflects specific theological concerns of the Irish Church. They are a complex and sophisticated form of visual, exegesis, designed to be read and interpreted by those who understood their symbolic language. They stand today as the most enduring public art of the Irish monastic Golden Age, silent stone preachers still telling their stories to the wind and the rain. The legacy of this period is not just in its artefacts, but also in the very soul of the Irish people. The deep respect for learning, the love of language and poetry, the sense of an intimate connection between the spiritual and the natural world, and the idea of the scholar saint as a cultural hero. All of these are threads that can be traced back to the monastic age. The story of the monks who saved civilization became a foundational myth for Irish cultural nationalism in later centuries, a source of immense pride, a reminder of a time when the island was not a poor colony on the edge of an empire, but a shining beacon of light for all of Europe. We can imagine our old monk, Aidan the scribe, reaching the end of his life. He is now the master of the scriptorium himself, his eyesight failing, his hands gnarled with arthritis from decades of work. He spends his days teaching a new generation of young novices how to hold a quill, how to mix the ink, how to form the beautiful flowing letters of the insular hand. He passes on the knowledge that was given to him, ensuring that the sacred craft will continue. He has spent his entire life within the walls of the monastery. He has never married, never owned property, never led an army. By the standards of the world outside, his has been a small and uneventful life. But in the evenings, when he sits in the dim light of the chapel for Vespers, he can look at the great gospel book on the altar, the one he spent 20 years of his life working on. He knows that its sister books, copied by his own hand, are now in monasteries in the mountains of Switzerland and the forests of Germany, carrying the light of his community to far-flung places. He knows that he has been a link in a great golden chain of transmission, stretching back to the apostles and, he prays, stretching forward to the end of time. His life has not been small. It has been dedicated to something vast, something eternal. He has fought his battle not with a sword, but with a quill, and in his own quiet way, he has helped to save the world. The sheer physical reality of the scriptorium deserves even closer inspection. The slanted desk the scribe worked at was not just a piece of furniture. It was a carefully designed piece of technology. Its angle was calculated to minimize the strain on the back and neck, and to allow gravity to help regulate the flow of ink from the quill. The scribe would often have a small lead weight, called a plummet, to hold the page down as he worked. He would have a collection of quills, each cut to a different width for different parts of the script. He had his knife, not just for sharpening the quills, but also for making corrections. This was his toolkit, the instruments of his sacred orchestra. Let's consider the vellum again. The choice of animal was significant. Calf skin, being finer and smoother, was reserved for the most important high-status manuscripts. The very best vellum made from the skin of stillborn or newborn calves was exquisitely fine, almost transparent, and was used for the most luxurious books destined for the altar or a royal patron. Sheepskin was more common or more utilitarian, used for everyday texts and school books. The scribe could tell the difference just by touch. He would also be able to distinguish the hair side from the flesh side of the skin. The hair side was slightly darker and rougher, and he would have to plan his book so that, whenever possible, 2 hair sides faced each other and 2 flesh sides faced each other, creating a pleasing visual uniformity when the book was opened. The process of binding the book, the codex, was another specialised craft. Once all the pages, or bifolia, were written and illuminated, they would be gathered into quires, or signatures, typically of 8 to 10 leaves. The scribe or a specialist binder would then pierce small holes along the central fold of each quire, and using a strong linen thread, would sew the quires together. A spine lining of leather would be glued on to reinforce the structure. The book was then given its cover. For a simple book, this might be a limp binding of plain leather, but for a great gospel book, the covers themselves would be works of art. Wooden boards would be attached, and then covered in decorated leather, or even with plates of precious metal studded with gems and intricate enamel work. The book was transformed into a treasure chest, its covers a magnificent gateway to the sacred words within. The Irish also developed a unique way of protecting their most sacred books, the book shrine, or cumdach. This was an ornate box-like container, often made of yew wood and covered with decorated plates of bronze, silver and gold. A particularly old or revered manuscript, especially one associated with the monastery's founding saint, would be permanently enshrined within its cumdach. The book itself would rarely, if ever, be opened again. Its power was now in its status as a relic. The shrine itself would be carried into battle as a standard, or used to add solemnity to the swearing of oaths. This practice speaks volumes about the Irish attitude to books. They were not just carriers of information, but objects of immense spiritual power, tangible links to the holy. Let us also consider the darker side of this life, the intense psychological pressures. The monk was engaged in a constant internal war against what the Desert Fathers had identified as the 8 evil thoughts, or demons: gluttony, lust, avarice, sadness, anger, acedia, a kind of spiritual sloth or listlessness, vainglory and pride. The entire monastic structure, the diet, the hard labour, the constant prayer, the rule of silence, was designed as a spiritual technology to combat these demons. Sadness or melancholy was a particularly feared state. A monk who fell into a deep depression would be seen as being under demonic attack. His brothers would pray over him, and the abbot would assign him specific penances and spiritual exercises to try and break the spell. Acedia was perhaps the most insidious enemy. It was not simple laziness, but a state of spiritual exhaustion and despair, a feeling that all the prayer and fasting was pointless, that God was distant and silent. It was the noonday demon that would tempt the monk to abandon his cell, to give up his vocation. The cure for acedia was perseverance, a blind, stubborn faith in the rhythm of the life. The monk was taught to simply keep going, to perform his duties in the chapel and the fields, even if his heart was not in it, trusting that God would eventually lift the darkness. This internal struggle was the green martyrdom in its purest form, a lonely and often terrifying battle waged in the silence of the monk's own heart. Now, let's step outside the monastery and into the world of the lay people who lived in its shadow. For them, the monastery was a place of awe, power, and mystery. It was where heaven and earth met. The sound of the monastic bell governed their day, telling them when to work and when to pray. They would bring their disputes to the abbot for judgment, and their sick to the infirmary for healing. They would come to the monastery on great feast days to attend Mass and to witness the magnificent rituals of the church. The sight of the monks in procession, the sound of their chanting, the glitter of the gold altar vessels, all of this would have been an overwhelming sensory experience, a glimpse of a different, more glorious world. They also believed that the monastery's founding saint was a powerful, active protector of his people. The saint's relics, a bone, a piece of clothing, or the bell he had used, were thought to possess miraculous power. The lay people would pray to the saint for a good harvest, for the health of their children, or for victory in battle. To swear a false oath on the relics of the saint was a terrifying sin that was thought to bring down instant and terrible divine punishment. The saint was the supernatural chieftain of his territory, and the monastery was his fortress. This deep popular piety was the foundation upon which the monastery's power and wealth were built. The lay community supported the monastery with gifts of land and produce, and in return the monastery provided them with spiritual protection, social services, and a connection to the sacred. Let's imagine a specific moment of crisis. A drought has afflicted the lands of the Tuath for months. The crops are failing, the cattle are dying, and the people are facing starvation. The local chieftain and his elders go to the abbot of the local monastery for help. The abbot declares a period of intense prayer and fasting for the entire community, both monastic and lay. Then, on a designated day, a great procession is formed. The monks emerge from the monastery gates chanting litanies. At the head of the procession, a senior monk carries the most sacred relic of the house, perhaps the enshrined gospel book of the founding saint. They walk the boundaries of the monastery's lands, an act known as a pattern, blessing the fields and praying for rain. For the lay people watching, this is a moment of intense hope. They are witnessing their spiritual champions going into battle on their behalf against the forces of nature, wielding the supernatural power of their holy patron. And if, by chance, the clouds gather and the rain begins to fall, it is seen as a direct answer to the monk's prayers, a miracle that reaffirms the power of the saint and the authority of his monastery. This close relationship, however, also had its tensions. The monastery's demand for land and resources could sometimes clash with the interests of the local farmers. The abbot's authority could be seen as a rival to the authority of the secular chieftain. The monastery was a powerful and sometimes demanding landlord, but for the most part the relationship was symbiotic. The monastery provided a degree of stability, knowledge, and spiritual certainty in a world that was often violent and unpredictable. It was the anchor that held the local community together. We have spoken of the Viking raids as an external shock, but their long-term impact was more complex. In the 10th and 11th centuries, a powerful dynasty of Irish kings, the Uí Briain, led by the famous Brian Boru, managed to unite much of Ireland and inflict a series of defeats on the Vikings, culminating in the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. This period saw a resurgence of native Irish power. The kings who led this fight, like Brian Boru, were often great patrons of the church. They funded the rebuilding of monasteries that had been damaged by the Vikings and commissioned new metalwork and manuscripts. The beautiful shrine of St. Patrick's Bell, for example, was created during this period of national revival. So, paradoxically, the Viking threat ultimately helped to foster a stronger sense of Irish identity and led to a final late flowering of Gaelic monastic art and patronage before the arrival of the Normans. This late period also saw the production of some of the most important historical and literary manuscripts. It was in the 11th and 12th centuries that monks began to compile the great collections of native Irish lore, the epic tales of Cuchulainn and the Ulster Cycle, the mythological stories of the Tuatha De Danann, the genealogies of the kings, and the annals that recorded the history of the island. They were writing down the oral traditions that had been preserved for centuries by the Fili. In doing so, they were acting as Christian scholars, but also as native Irish antiquarians, preserving the memory of their own pre-Christian past. It is almost entirely thanks to the work of these late-period monastic scribes that we know anything at all about the rich mythology and literature of ancient Ireland. They Christianized the stories, to be sure, but they preserved their essential spirit, creating a unique and powerful national literature. And so the monastery was not a static institution. It evolved dramatically over its long history. It began as a small, ascetic community seeking to escape the world. It grew into a powerful, wealthy and learned city-state, deeply enmeshed in that world. It suffered through the trauma of the Viking invasions and enjoyed a period of renewed patronage and cultural production. It faced the challenge of the European reform movement and was gradually transformed by it. And finally, it was overwhelmed by the political and cultural changes brought by the Anglo-Norman conquest. It is a story of rise, adaptation and decline, a microcosm of the larger historical forces that shaped medieval Ireland. But through it all, the central rhythm of the life remained. every night, in the freezing dark, Brother Aidan or Brother Finian or Brother Coleman would be woken by the bell. He would pull on his rough wool habit and make his way to the small stone chapel. His voice would join with those of his brothers, chanting the same psalms that had been chanted in that place for hundreds of years. In that moment, the political struggles, the wealth of the monastery, the threat of raiders, all of it would fall away. There was only the darkness, the cold, the flickering candlelight on the altar, and the timeless words of the psalm rising into the night. It was in these quiet, repeated acts of devotion, performed day after day, year after year, century after century, that the true life of the monastery is to be found. This constant rhythm of prayer was the bedrock of their existence, the unchanging foundation upon which the more variable work of the day was built. But to see the monk's life as a simple dichotomy of prayer and physical labour is to miss the third and perhaps most vital element, study. For the Irish monk, intellectual engagement was not a separate category from prayer. It was a form of prayer in itself. The act of reading a sacred text, of wrestling with a difficult theological problem, or of learning the intricacies of Latin grammar was known as lectio divina, or divine reading. It was an act of worship performed with the mind. The culture of study permeated the monastery. Even a monk whose primary work was in the fields or the forge was expected to be literate and to participate in the life of the mind. The texts they studied were not easy. The Bible itself, particularly the Old Testament, is filled with complex allegories, obscure prophecies, and apparent contradictions. The writings of the Church Fathers, like Augustine, were works of profound philosophical and theological depth. To understand, these texts required a rigorous intellectual training and a specific set of interpretive tools. The Irish monks became masters of a method of biblical interpretation known as exegesis, which sought to uncover the multiple layers of meaning hidden within the sacred text. They believed that a passage of Scripture had not one but 4 levels of meaning. First was the literal meaning, the straightforward historical narrative. Second was the allegorical meaning, how the passage related to the doctrines of the Church and the life of Christ. Third was the tropological or moral meaning, what the passage taught the individual about how to live a virtuous life. And fourth was the anagogical meaning, how the passage pointed towards the future, towards the promise of heaven and the end of time. A learned monk could take a single verse and expound upon it for hours, peeling back these layers of meaning like the layers of an onion, revealing a universe of theological significance hidden within a few simple words. This intellectual discipline was the engine that drove their scholarship, and made their schools the most advanced in Europe. One of the most remarkable and intimate windows we have into this world of study is the practice of glossing. As an Irish monk read a difficult Latin text, he would often write notes or commentaries in the margins or between the lines of the text itself. These notes, or glosses, are a treasure trove for modern scholars. Some are purely academic. They might be a grammatical note, explaining a difficult verb conjugation. They might be a synonym, offering a simpler Latin word for a more obscure one. Or they might be a direct translation of a Latin word into Old Irish, giving us an invaluable record of the earlier stages of the written Irish language. These glosses show us the monk's mind at work, actively grappling with the text in front of him. But they are not all academic. Sometimes the glosses are deeply personal, little windows into the scribe state of mind. Tucked away in the margin of a great theological treatise, a monk might write a short, poignant comment in Old Irish. One famous gloss complains, "It is cold tonight." Another, written beside a particularly dense passage, simply says, "This is difficult." Yet another, at the end of a long day's work, sighs, "The work is hard, and the vellum is hairy." These small human complaints collapse the centuries, allowing us to feel a direct connection to the anonymous man who sat in a cold stone cell over 1,000 years ago, his hand aching, his eyes tired, but his mind still focused on his sacred task. Perhaps the most famous of these marginalia is a beautiful short poem found in a 9th century manuscript, written by a monk about his cat, Pangur Ban. While his fellow monks are away, he sits at his desk, and in the margin of his serious Latin text, he compares his own scholarly hunt for meaning with his cat's hunt for mice. He writes, "I and Pangur Ban, my cat, 'tis us, like task we're at. Hunting mice is his delight. Hunting words I sit all night, so in peace our tasks we ply. Panga ban, my cat and I. In our arts we find our bliss. I have mine and he has his. This charming, deeply personal poem tells us more about the quiet, contemplative joy of the scholarly life than a dozen historical treatises. It reveals a world where even the smallest of creatures could be a companion and a source of gentle wisdom. At the very end of a manuscript, after months or even years of laborious copying, a scribe would often add a final note, known as a colophon. These colophons are another precious source of information. They might give the scribe's name, the name of the monastery where he worked, and the date the work was completed. But often, they also include a prayer or a personal plea to the reader. A common formula was to ask the reader to pray for the soul of the scribe who had laboured so long on the book. One colophon memorably expresses the sheer physical relief of finishing. As the traveller rejoices to see his native land, so the scribe rejoices to see the end of his book. These small personal touches are a powerful reminder that these magnificent, seemingly superhuman works of art were created by mortal men, with aching backs, tired eyes, and a deep longing for both salvation and the simple satisfaction of a job well done. Central to the spiritual life of the monk, and a concept that the Irish Church gave to the wider world, was the idea of the Anamkara, or soul friend. The Anamkara was a spiritual guide, a confessor, a mentor to whom a monk would reveal his innermost thoughts, his struggles, his temptations, and his spiritual progress. This was not a hierarchical relationship, but one of deep, mutual trust. The soul friend was not there to judge, but to listen, to offer counsel, and to prescribe the appropriate spiritual remedies, or penances, for the soul's ailments. The relationship was seen as essential for spiritual growth. A famous Irish proverb states, "A person without a soul friend is like a body without a head." This practice of regular private confession and spiritual direction was a major innovation. It fostered a deep culture of introspection and psychological awareness. The monk was encouraged to become a keen observer of his own inner world, to identify the roots of his sins and temptations, and to actively work on his own spiritual formation. The Anamkara was the trusted guide on this difficult inner journey. This intensely personal approach to spirituality was one of the great strengths of the Celtic Church, and as Irish monks travelled to the continent, they brought this practice with them, profoundly influencing the pastoral theology of the entire Western Church. The modern Catholic practice of private confession is, in many ways, a direct descendant of the relationship between an Irish monk and his soul friend. This inward focus did not lead to a disengagement from the world, but rather to a unique way of seeing it. The Irish monastic imagination was profoundly shaped by the doctrine of the Trinity. They were fascinated by the concept of three in one, and saw threeness everywhere in the natural world. The shamrock, which St. Patrick reputedly used to explain the Trinity, is the most famous example, but there were countless others. The world was full of triads, land, sea and sky, sun, moon and stars, past, present and future. The intricate three-pointed spiral or triskel that appears so frequently in their art is a direct visual representation of this Trinitarian worldview. For the Irish monk, the very structure of creation was a testament to the nature of God. This perception of God's presence in the world also shaped their understanding of holiness. For them, holiness was not something confined to the cloister or the chapel. It could be found everywhere. A place could be made holy not just by the presence of a church or a relic, but by the raw beauty of its creation, or by the memory of a saint who had prayed there. This is why hermits would seek out remote and beautiful places to live. They were not just escaping the world, they were seeking a more direct encounter with God in his creation. This created a sacred geography in Ireland, a landscape dotted with holy wells, holy mountains and sacred islands, each with its own story, its own saint, and its own particular spiritual power. The boundary between the natural and the supernatural was porous, almost non-existent. Let's now turn to the monastery's function as a legal and social institution, which was deeply intertwined with the native Irish legal system, the Brehon laws. The Brehon laws were a sophisticated and remarkably humane system of civil law, concerned with every aspect of life, from property rights and marriage contracts to the compensation due for injury or insult. A key principle of this system was that almost any crime, including murder, could be rectified through the payment of a fine or honour price to the victim or their family. The monastery had a complex relationship with this legal world. One of the most important legal functions of the monastery was to provide sanctuary. The area within the vallum, and often a larger area of land around it, was known as the termen, or sanctuary lands. A person who was fleeing from justice or from a blood feud could claim sanctuary within this area. As long as they remained within the termen, they were under the protection of the monastery's founding saint and could not be harmed. This was a crucial social safety valve, a way of interrupting cycles of violence and allowing for a cooling-off period where a negotiated settlement could be reached. The abbot would often act as the mediator in such disputes, using his spiritual and political authority to broker a peace agreement that was acceptable under Brehon law. The monastery also played a vital role in the education and upbringing of the Gaelic aristocracy through the system of fosterage. It was a common practice for a king or a powerful chieftain to send his son to be fostered and educated in a major monastery. This had multiple benefits. The boy would receive the best education available in the country, learning Latin, law, and perhaps even the arts of war from the monastery's lay retainers. The king, in turn, would forge a powerful bond with the monastery, ensuring its loyalty and support, and the monastery would gain influence over the next generation of secular rulers. Many of the most famous abbots and bishops of the Irish Church began their careers as foster sons in a monastery, and many of the most pious kings were those who had been educated by monks in their youth. The monastery also acted as a kind of proto-bank and safe deposit box for the local community. In a world with no formal financial institutions, the monastery was the most secure place to store wealth. A chieftain might deposit his family's ancestral treasures, fine metalwork, jewellery and ceremonial weapons, in the monastery's treasury for safekeeping. The monks, as literate record keepers, would also hold important legal documents such as genealogies and land charters. This function as a secure repository of both wealth and information further cemented the monastery's position as the indispensable centre of its local society. Of course, it was this very concentration of wealth that would later make the monastery such an attractive target for Viking raiders. Let us now return to the arts and crafts of the monastery, and look beyond the scriptorium to the forge and the workshop. The same artistic genius that produced the Book of Kells also found expression in metal. The great masterpieces of Irish metalwork, such as the Ardagh chalice and the Tara brooch, were almost certainly created in monastic workshops. These objects are a testament to a level of technical skill and artistic vision that was unsurpassed anywhere in the world at the time. Imagine the creation of the Ardagh chalice, a magnificent silver cup made in the 8th century likely for use in the Mass. A master craftsman, a monk, or a lay artisan working under monastic patronage would have begun with simple sheets of silver. He would have hammered them into the perfect simple shape of the cup and its base. Then, the work of decoration would begin. He would have used a technique called filigree, where tiny thread-like wires of gold are twisted and plaited into intricate interlaced patterns and then soldered onto the surface of the chalice. He would have employed granulation, a mind-bogglingly difficult technique where minuscule spheres of gold are arranged into patterns and fused to the surface. He would have set polished studs of blue and red enamel, their vibrant colours glowing like jewels against the silver and gold. Around the girdle of the cup, he would have subtly engraved the names of the 12 apostles in the beautiful flowing letters of the insular script. Every single element of the chalice, from its overall harmonious form to the tiniest microscopic gold bead, was executed with a breathtaking precision and a flawless sense of design. To hold it would be to hold an object of almost supernatural beauty, a fitting vessel to contain the blood of Christ. It was a physical manifestation of the same aesthetic that animated the carpet pages of the great manuscripts, an obsession with intricate detail, a love of abstract pattern, and a belief that the highest human skill should be offered in service to God. This skill was not confined to luxury items. The monastic craftsmen produced a whole range of objects for liturgical use. They made croziers, the ceremonial staffs of abbots and bishops, often shaped like a shepherd's crook and lavishly decorated with enamel and interlace. They made the beautiful, house-shaped shrines for the relics of saints, and the book shrines, the kumdaks that we have already discussed. Each of these objects was a fusion of art and theology, a powerful statement of faith expressed in metal, wood, and stone. Even the most everyday objects were often made with a simple, functional beauty. The monks were skilled carpenters, potters, and leather workers. They built their own furniture, made their own ceramic vessels for cooking and eating, and crafted the leather satchels that they used to carry their precious books. There was a deep-seated respect for craftsmanship, a belief that any work, no matter how humble, should be done to the best of one's ability, for the glory of God. This aesthetic sense, this marriage of beauty and utility, permeated every aspect of monastic life. Let us now consider the realities of the life and death, of health and disease in this world. The monastic diet, while simple, was likely healthier than that of the surrounding lay population. It was based on whole grains like oats and barley, fresh vegetables from the monastery garden, and protein from cheese, milk, eggs, and fish. This would have provided a solid nutritional foundation. However, the monks were still vulnerable to the same diseases that plagued the entire medieval world. Plague, dysentery, smallpox, and other infectious diseases could sweep through a community with devastating effect. The close quarters of monastic life would have made contagion almost inevitable. The monastic infirmary, under the care of a brother like Adair, was the community's first line of defence. Its knowledge was a mixture of empirical observation, classical medical texts, what little of them survived, and folk wisdom. The herbal remedies they used were often effective for treating symptoms and minor ailments. They knew how to clean and stitch a wound, and how to set a broken bone. But against a major epidemic or a serious internal illness, they were largely helpless. Their primary response in the face of such a crisis was spiritual. They would pray, fast, and appeal to their patron, saint. Illness was often seen as a spiritual trial, a test of faith or a punishment for sin. Recovery was a sign of God's mercy. When a monk knew he was approaching the end of his life, it was a profound moment for the entire community. He would be brought to the infirmary, and if possible he would be laid on a mat of sackcloth and ashes on the floor, in a final act of humility and penance. The abbot and the other monks would gather around him. He would make his final confession and receive the last rites, the anointing of the sick. The brothers would begin to chant the psalms of commendation, praying for his soul as it began its journey from this world to the next. The death of a monk was a solemn, ritualized event, a moment of sorrow but also of hope, the culmination of a life lived in preparation for this very moment. After his death, the monk's body would be washed and dressed in his habit. A vigil would be kept over the body, with monks taking turns to chant the Psalter continuously until the time of the funeral. The funeral mass would be celebrated, and then the entire community would process to the monastic cemetery, a small plot of consecrated ground usually located to the east of the main church. The monk would be buried in a simple, unmarked grave, his body oriented east-west, so that on the day of the resurrection he would rise facing the dawn. He was laid to rest among the generations of his brothers who had lived and died in that same place, his individual identity subsumed in death, as it had been in life, into the collective body of the community. The concept of the afterlife was ever present in the monk's mind. It was the ultimate reality towards which his entire life was oriented. Their understanding of the afterlife was vivid and often terrifying. Hell was a place of eternal physical torment of fire and ice, described in graphic detail in homilies and visionary texts. Heaven was a place of eternal light, peace, and blissful contemplation of the face of God. But there was also a strong belief in an intermediate state, a kind of purgatory, where the souls of those who had died in a state of grace but were not yet pure enough for heaven would undergo a period of cleansing punishment. This belief was the driving force behind one of the most important social functions of the monastery, prayer for the dead. A wealthy lay patron would grant land or treasure to a monastery in exchange for a promise that the monks would say masses and prayers for his soul and for the souls of his ancestors in perpetuity. This was seen as a vital spiritual investment, a way of shortening one's time in the torments of purgatory. The monasteries became great prayer factories, their constant cycle of liturgy a spiritual engine working for the salvation of their benefactors. This is another reason why the great monasteries became so wealthy. They were providing an essential service, not for this life, but for the next. Let us zoom in on the physical landscape of the monastery and its agricultural economy. The land immediately surrounding the main enclosure was the most intensively farmed. Here would be the vegetable gardens, the herb garden for the infirmary, and perhaps an orchard with apple trees. Further out were the great arable fields, often farmed in a system of crop rotation to maintain the fertility of the soil. Beyond the fields lay the pasture lands, where the monastery's vast herds of cattle and sheep would graze under the watchful eye of a herdsman monk or a lay tenant. And at the furthest edge of the monastery's lands would be the woodlands, which provided timber for building, fuel for the fires, and pannage, the right to graze pigs on fallen acorns and beech mast. The monastery was a marvel of resource management. The monks understood their environment intimately. They knew how to drain marshland to create new pasture. They knew where to build their mill to take best advantage of the river's current. They practiced beekeeping, not just for the honey, which was their main source of sweetness, but also for the beeswax, which was essential for making the candles that lit the church and the scriptorium. They were not just holy men, they were highly skilled farmers, engineers, and estate managers. The prosperity and survival of their community depended on this practical knowledge. The seasonal rhythm of this agricultural work was the second great clock of monastic life, running parallel to the liturgical clock of the divine office. The year was marked by a series of key events. In late winter came the lambing season. Spring was the time for ploughing and sowing. Early summer was for the shearing of the sheep, their wool being a vital economic product. Late summer and early autumn were dominated by the hay harvest, and then the grain harvest, the most intense and crucial period of the entire year. Late autumn was the time for slaughtering excess livestock that could not be fed over the winter, and for salting and preserving the meat. Each season brought its own tasks, its own challenges, and its own particular satisfaction. This constant engagement with the natural cycles of the earth grounded the monks' spiritual lives in a deep, physical reality. Let us now return to the great missionary impulse and explore its later phases. The initial wave of the Pregrinatio had established major Irish foundations across Europe. The next generation of Irish scholars were not so much founders as they were teachers and intellectuals who were drawn to the great courts of the new Carolingian Empire. One of the most brilliant of these was Johannes Scotus Erugena, who was active in the court of the West Frankish king Charles the Bald in the mid-9th century. Erugena was a towering intellectual figure, one of the most original thinkers of the entire early medieval period. His command of Greek was so exceptional that he was commissioned by the king to translate the works of a complex Greek mystical theologian, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, into Latin. This work introduced a powerful stream of Neoplatonic thought into the Western intellectual tradition. Erugena went on to write his own philosophical masterpiece, the Periphysion on the Division of Nature, a vast, complex and highly speculative work that attempted to synthesize Christian theology with the Neoplatonic philosophical tradition. His work was so advanced and in some aspects so unorthodox that it was later condemned by the Church. But it stands as a testament to the extraordinary intellectual heights that the Irish scholarly tradition could reach. Erugena was a product of a system that valued not just faith, but also rigorous, daring intellectual inquiry. These Irish scholars on the continent known as the Scotti Peregrini often formed close-knit communities in the monasteries where they worked. They maintained a strong sense of their own identity, continuing to use their distinctive script and to study the Irish language. They exchanged letters, poems, and books with one another, creating an old boys network of Irish intellectuals across Europe. They often expressed a deep sense of longing or nostalgia for their homeland. A 9th century poem by an Irish exile named Colman expresses this beautifully. What avail is fame or fate, or a high and mighty state, in a land however fair, if the heart is eaten with care? Better far to be, I say, in a cot of wattles and clay, watching o'er the flock and fold, than in palaces of gold. This poignant sense of exile, of being a stranger in a strange land, was the emotional price they paid for their white martyrdom. It is important to understand that this entire cultural edifice was built upon a fragile foundation. The production of a single manuscript was an act of defiance against the entropy of a world where everything was subject to decay. Books were vulnerable to fire, to damp, to being eaten by rodents. A monastery's library, built up over centuries, could be destroyed in a single night by a Viking raid or an accidental fire. We only possess a tiny fraction of the manuscripts that were created in these monasteries. For every book of Kells that survives, there are hundreds, perhaps thousands of other books that have been lost to time. What we have is the beautiful wreckage of a civilization, the improbable survivors of 1,000 years of war, neglect and decay. This sense of loss and fragmentation is palpable when we study the manuscripts themselves. Many are incomplete. The Book of Kells itself is missing its beginning and its end. Other books survive only as a few scattered pages, which were later used by bookbinders in the 16th and 17th centuries as scrap material to reinforce the spines of newer printed books. Scholars have painstakingly reassembled these fragments, like pieces of a vast shattered mosaic, to reconstruct the lost intellectual world of the Irish monks. Each surviving manuscript is a miracle, a message in a bottle that has somehow washed ashore on the coast of our own time. Let us imagine the monastery at the height of its power and influence, on a great feast day, perhaps Easter Sunday. The entire local population would gather at the monastery. Merchants would set up stalls outside the walls, creating a festive market. Inside, the main church would be packed. The air would be thick with the smoke of incense and the light of hundreds of beeswax candles. The abbot, dressed in his most magnificent vestments, would preside over the Mass. The altar would be dressed with the finest embroidered cloths and adorned with the monastery's greatest treasures, the Ardagh chalice, the silver patens, and the great illuminated gospel book resting on a stand for all to see. The sound would be glorious. The monastic choir, its numbers swelled for the occasion, would sing the triumphant chants of the Easter liturgy. The lay people would listen in awe, their own rougher voices joining in on the simple responses. After the Mass, the abbot might host a great feast for the local chieftain and other important guests. The monastery's rule of silence would be relaxed, and the great hall would be filled with the sounds of talk and laughter. It would be a day of profound religious joy, but also a powerful display of the monastery's wealth, authority, and its central place in the life of the community. It was the church militant and triumphant, its spiritual power made manifest in a spectacle of worldly splendour. Now contrast this with the image of a small hermitage site, a desert in the Irish sense. A single monk, an anchorite, has chosen to withdraw even from the life of the community, to seek God in absolute solitude. His home is a single stone cell, a closhan, on a remote island or a high mountainside. His life is one of almost unimaginable austerity. He lives on what he can grow in a tiny hand-tilled garden plot, supplemented by shellfish from the rocks and the eggs of seabirds. His days are spent in ceaseless prayer, his only companions the wind, the sea, and the God he has come here to find. This eremitical ideal was the spiritual core, the radioactive centre of Irish monasticism. Even the largest and wealthiest monastery saw itself as growing from this seed of solitary contemplation. The great founding saints, like Kevin of Glendalough or Enda of the Aran Islands, all began their careers as hermits. The life of the anchorite was seen as the highest and most difficult calling, a path reserved for the most spiritually advanced. These solitary figures, dotted across the wildest parts of the Irish landscape, were the spiritual commandos of their rege, engaged in a direct personal combat with the forces of darkness. Their prayers were believed to be immensely powerful, and their holiness was a source of spiritual energy for the entire Irish church. The physical remains of these hermitages are among the most evocative ruins in all of Ireland. On the island of Skellig Michael, to climb the 600 stone steps that the monks carved into the cliff face, to stand in one of the small, perfectly built beehive huts, and to look out at the vast, empty expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, is to come as close as one can to touching the spirit of these men. You can feel the intensity of their faith, their courage, and their radical commitment to a life stripped down to its barest essentials. It is a place that silences the mind and awakens a sense of awe, a testament to the extraordinary spiritual ambitions of the culture that created it. The relationship between the large communal monastery and the solitary hermit was symbiotic. The hermit provided a living example of the ascetic ideal that the larger community was striving for. The community, in turn, provided support for the hermit. A monk might be sent out from the main monastery on a regular basis to bring supplies, a loaf of bread, some vellum for writing, to a hermit in a nearby cell. Or a monk who had spent many years in the communal life might receive permission from his abbot to live out his final years as an anchorite, as a final preparation for death. The two forms of life were not in opposition, but were seen as two different points on the same spiritual spectrum. Let us consider the role of women in this world. While the great majority of the monasteries we have discussed were for men, there was also a parallel and vibrant tradition of female monasticism. St. Bridget's foundation at Kildare was the most famous of these. It was a double monastery, a community of both monks and nuns governed by an abbess. This was a common model in the early Celtic Church. The Abbess of Kildare was one of the most powerful ecclesiastical figures in Ireland, her authority equal to that of any abbot or bishop. This suggests that, at least in the early period, the Irish Church offered women positions of leadership and influence that were rare in other parts of the Christian world. Nuns followed a similar rule of life to their male counterparts, with the same cycle of prayer and work. We know that some female communities had their own scriptoria and produced illuminated manuscripts, although very few of these have survived. They were also renowned for their skill in fine needlework and embroidery, creating the beautiful vestments and altar cloths that were used in the churches. While our historical sources for female monasticism are much scarcer than those for the male houses, it is clear that women played a vital role in the spiritual and cultural life of the early Irish Church. As the Church underwent the 12th century reforms and came more into line with continental practice, the status of these female communities often declined. The model of the double monastery was suppressed, and the authority of the abbesses was curtailed in favour of the bishops. However, communities of nuns, particularly those following the Augustinian rule, continued to exist and even flourish throughout the medieval period. They provided an important outlet for the spiritual and intellectual aspirations of women in a society that offered them few other opportunities for a life outside of marriage and the family. We should also reflect on the darker side of the ascetic impulse, the extreme forms of penance that can seem shocking to modern sensibilities. The penitentials prescribe physical punishments, such as flogging for serious offences. The practice of the cross vigil, holding one's arms outstretched for hours while reciting psalms, was a form of physical ordeal that could be excruciatingly painful. These practices were born of a worldview that saw the body and its passions as a dangerous, rebellious enemy that had to be brutally subdued. The flesh was the source of temptation, the gateway through which the devil could enter the soul. To mortify the flesh was to weaken the enemy. This was a spirituality of extremes, of heroic struggle. The lives of the Irish saints are filled with stories of epic ascetic feats. St. Kevin was said to have stood so still in prayer for so long that a blackbird built a nest in his outstretched hand. St. Ciaran was said to have worn animal skins that were deliberately kept damp to increase his discomfort. These stories, whether literally true or not, illustrate the ideal. The holy man as a spiritual warrior, pushing the limits of human endurance in his quest for God. It was a harsh and demanding faith, one that left little room for comfort or compromise. But it was this very intensity that fueled their extraordinary achievements. They were spiritual athletes, and their relentless training regimen produced a generation of saints, scholars, and artists who changed the course of European history. Let us examine the monastery's role in one more specific area: music. While we have no written musical notation from the earliest period, the texts themselves and later manuscripts tell us a great deal about the importance of music in their worship. The psalms were not simply recited, they were sung in a form of plain chant that was likely unique to the Irish Church. This chant would have been monophonic, a single melodic line sung in unison by the choir. The melodies would have been designed to carry the Latin text with clarity and beauty, their contours rising and falling with the natural rhythm of the language. The Irish were also great lovers of the harp, the central instrument of the secular poetic tradition. While instrumental music was often viewed with suspicion in the early church, it is likely that the harp found its way into the monastic world. The image of King David playing his harp was a very popular one in manuscript illumination, and the Psalms themselves are full of references to musical instruments. It is possible that the harp was used to accompany the singing of religious poetry, or simply as an aid to private contemplation. The sound of the harp, with its clear resonant tones, would have fit perfectly into the quiet, contemplative atmosphere of the monastery. The very structure of the poetry written by the monks, both in Latin and in Irish, is intensely musical. It is characterised by complex patterns of rhyme, alliteration, and assonance. These poems were meant to be heard, to be recited or chanted aloud. The sound of the words was as important as their meaning. This deep sensitivity to the music of language is another hallmark of the Irish intellectual tradition, a direct inheritance from the pre-Christian oral culture of the Fili. The monks were not just scholars, they were poets and musicians who understood the power of sound to move the human heart and elevate the soul to God. Let us take a final, closer look at the process of decline. The 12th century reform was not a hostile takeover. It was a movement largely led by Irish churchmen who genuinely believed that the native church had become corrupt and isolated. Figures like St Malachy of Armagh travelled to the continent, met with reformers like St Bernard of Clairvaux, and were deeply impressed by the order, discipline, and architectural splendour of the new Cistercian order. They returned to Ireland determined to bring their own church up to this new European standard. The introduction of the Cistercians and other continental orders was a deliberate strategy to achieve this. These new foundations were established with the full support of the most powerful Irish kings, who saw them as a way to modernise their own kingdoms. The result was a gradual but profound cultural shift. The old Gaelic monasteries, with their deep local roots and their often hereditary abbesses, were slowly squeezed out. They lost the patronage of the great kings, and their lands were often granted to the new, more fashionable orders. The intellectual centre of gravity shifted. The study of native Irish law and literature, which had been a feature of the old monasteries, was not part of the curriculum for the French and English monks who now came to Ireland. The Anglo-Norman invasion institutionalised this division. The areas of Ireland under Norman control, the Pale, became culturally and ecclesiastically English. The great abbeys in this region were populated by Anglo-Norman monks and were integrated into the English Church. In the parts of Ireland that remained under Gaelic control, the old monastic traditions continued, but they were now isolated and impoverished. They were no longer part of a vibrant international network of scholarship, but were instead bastions of a native culture that was increasingly under siege. The final death blow to monasticism in Ireland, both Gaelic and Anglo-Norman, came much later, with the Tudor conquest and the Reformation in the 16th century. Henry VI's policy of the dissolution of the monasteries was brutally enforced in Ireland. The great abbeys, which had been centres of faith and culture, for 1,000 years were suppressed, their communities disbanded, their lands confiscated by the crown, and their magnificent buildings stripped of their wealth and left to fall into ruin. The monks were scattered, forced to become parish priests or to flee to the continent. The unbroken chain of monastic life, which had survived the Vikings and the Normans, was finally and decisively broken. And so, when we look at the ruins today, we are seeing the end of this long and complex story. We are seeing the empty shells of a civilization that was systematically dismantled. But the stones themselves still speak. They speak of the faith of the men who built them, of the beauty they created, and of the world they preserved. They are not just monuments of a bygone age. They are a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, to create light in the darkness, to preserve memory in the face of oblivion, and to build things of beauty that can withstand the ravages of time. Let's imagine, for a moment, the library of a great monastery like Clonmanoise in its heyday. It would not have been a large, open room like a modern library, but more likely a collection of small chambers or chests where the precious codices were stored. The books would have been kept flat on shelves or in individual leather satchels to protect them. The collection would have been the monastery's greatest treasure, more valuable than any amount of gold or silver. It would have contained not just the sacred texts of the faith, but a comprehensive collection of all available knowledge. There would be the grammars of Priscian and Donatus, the essential textbooks for learning Latin. There would be works of classical literature, poetry, and philosophy. There would be the histories of writers like Eusebius and Orosius, which provided the framework for understanding world history. There would be works of science and mathematics, such as the astronomical calculations of Bede and the encyclopedic works of Isidore of Seville. And of course, there would be the great collection of native Irish material, the law tracts, the genealogies, and the epic tales. The abbot and the senior scholars of the community would be the custodians of this vast intellectual inheritance. To have access to such a library in the early medieval period was to be at one of the intellectual command centres of the Western world. The process of acquiring new books was a constant preoccupation. A monk travelling to another monastery in Ireland or on the continent would be tasked with borrowing a specific book so that it could be copied. The loan of a manuscript was a serious matter, sometimes requiring the deposit of a valuable object as security. When the borrowed book arrived, the scribes of the scriptorium would set to work, making a new copy before the original had to be returned. This slow, laborious process of borrowing and copying was the medieval equivalent of the internet, the way that knowledge was shared and disseminated across the Christian world. Let's also consider the impact of the Irish on the very form of the book itself. Before the Irish missionary effort, books on the continent were often written in a script known as scriptura continua, continuous writing with no spaces between the words. This made the text very difficult to read. The Irish monks, for whom Latin was a foreign language, developed and popularised the practice of separating the words with spaces. This seemingly simple innovation made books infinitely more legible and easier to read. As Irish-trained scribes established scriptoria across Europe, this practice spread, fundamentally changing the appearance of the written page and making knowledge more accessible. They also played a key role in the development of punctuation. They introduced a range of symbols and marks to indicate pauses, questions, and the structure of sentences. This too was an aid to reading, especially for reading aloud in the liturgy. The modern system of punctuation is, in part, a distant echo of the grammatical and scribal innovations that were worked out in the cold, quiet scriptoria of early medieval Ireland. Their influence is so fundamental to the way we read today that it has become almost invisible to us. Let's revisit the high crosses and consider their function as boundary markers. Monasteries often had a series of crosses starting at the outer edge of their lands and leading towards the sacred centre. To pass a cross was to enter a more sacred zone, to move deeper into the spiritual force field of the monastery. The final, most elaborate cross would stand near the west door of the main church, the last threshold before entering the most holy space of all. These crosses were not just artistic objects, they were part of the spiritual technology of the monastery, signposts on a physical and spiritual journey from the profane to the sacred. Let's consider the economic power of these institutions from another angle. The great monasteries were the only entities that could organise large-scale public works. If a bridge needed to be built, a road repaired, or a bog drained, it was often the monastery that had the resources, the manpower, and the organisational skill to accomplish the task. They were the primary drivers of economic development and infrastructure improvement in their regions. The abbot of a major house was, in many respects, the equivalent of a modern-day CEO and Minister for Public Works, all rolled into one. This also meant that the monastery was a major centre for trade. They produced a surplus of agricultural goods, wool, hides, grain, which they could sell or trade. They needed to import goods that they could not produce themselves, such as salt, essential for preserving food, iron, and luxury goods like wine for the mass and the precious pigments for their scriptoria. The great monastic towns like Kells and Armagh became centres of commerce, attracting merchants from Britain and the continent. The image of the monastery as a purely contemplative retreat is incomplete. It was also a bustling hub of economic activity, a key node in the nascent trade networks of the early medieval world. let us explore the imaginative world of the monk a little further. His mind was steeped in stories. He knew the epic tales of the Bible, the struggles of the Israelites, the miracles of the prophets, the drama of the Gospels. He knew the lives of the saints, which were filled with heroic asceticism, miraculous healings, and epic battles with demons. And he knew the great stories of his own Gaelic past, the sagas of heroes like Cuchulainn and Fionn MacCumhaill. This rich narrative tapestry shaped his understanding of the world. He saw life as a story, a pilgrimage filled with trials and triumphs, with heroes and villains, all moving towards a final divine resolution. This storytelling impulse is evident in everything they created. The panels of a high cross tell a story. The intricate decorations of a manuscript often contain hidden narrative scenes. The annals, the historical records kept by the monks, are not just a dry list of dates and events. They are a carefully constructed narrative, designed to show the hand of God at work in the history of Ireland. The monks were not just guardians of knowledge, they were master storytellers, who understood that a memorable story was the most powerful way to convey a profound truth. Let us consider what it would have been like to be a guest at one of these monasteries. As a traveller, you would be welcomed at the gatehouse by the guest master. Your social status would determine the level of hospitality you received. If you were a simple pilgrim, you might be given a bed in a communal dormitory and a simple meal of bread and ale. If you were a king or a bishop, you would be lodged in a private chamber, and the abbot would host a feast in your honour, serving the best food and wine the monastery could provide. Regardless of your status, the ritual of welcome would be the same. Your feet would be washed, in imitation of Christ washing the feet of his disciples. You would be invited to join the monks for prayer in the church. For the duration of your stay, you were under the protection of the monastery. This sacred duty of hospitality was a vital social function. The monasteries were the inns and hotels of their day, a network of safe havens that made travel possible in a dangerous and fragmented world. The infirmary also served the lay community. If you were a farmer who had been gored by a bull, or a child suffering from a high fever, your family's first recourse would be to bring you to the monastery. The infirmary monk would treat your wounds with his herbal remedies, and just as importantly, the community would pray for your recovery. The monastery was the hospital, the clinic, and the hospice for the entire region. This charitable work was a key part of their Christian mission, and a major source of their popular support and legitimacy. Let us return to the moment of the Norman invasion and see it from the perspective of a monk in an old Gaelic monastery. For him, the invaders were a new and terrifying kind of foreigner. They were not pagan raiders like the Vikings, but they were culturally alien. They fought with new methods, with armoured knights on horseback and castles of stone. They spoke a different language, French, and they brought with them a different kind of church, one that was more rigid, more centralised, and often contemptuous of the old Irish traditions. He would have watched as the new Norman lords dispossessed the monastery's traditional Gaelic patrons. He might have seen his own monastery's lands granted to a new Cistercian or Augustinian house, populated by French or English monks. He would have seen the old, familiar ways of the Celtic Church being suppressed in favour of the Roman Rite. For this monk, the Norman invasion would have been a catastrophe, not just a political event, but a cultural and spiritual conquest that threatened to extinguish the traditions he had dedicated his life to preserving. The survival of the Gaelic monastic tradition in the later medieval period was an act of cultural resistance. In the unconquered parts of Ireland, the old monasteries became repositories of Gaelic identity. They continued to patronise the traditional Irish arts, to copy the old law tracts, and to compile the annals of the Irish kings. They were islands of Gaelic culture in an increasingly anglicised world. The scribes who worked in these monasteries in the 14th and 15th centuries knew that they were engaged in a salvage operation, preserving the memory of a world that was fading away. The great manuscripts they produced, like the Book of Ballymote or the Lerbar Brice, are a testament to their resilience and their enduring love for their own native culture. Let us think about the end of a monastery. Not the violent end of a Viking raid, or the formal suppression of the Reformation, but a slow, gradual fading away. A small monastery in a remote location might simply fail to attract new novices. The community would grow older and smaller. The fields would become overgrown, The roofs of the buildings would begin to leak. The last few elderly monks would struggle to maintain the daily round of prayer. Finally, the last monk would die. For the first time in centuries, the bell would fall silent. The wind and the rain would begin their patient work of dismantling the stone walls. The forest would creep back in, covering the fields. Within a generation or two, all that would be left would be a few crumbling walls and a collection of weathered gravestones, the silent testament to a community that had simply ceased to be. This slow, quiet decay was the fate of many of the smaller houses, an entropy that was as inexorable as any invading army. This sense of melancholy, of the transience of all human endeavours, is a powerful theme in the poetry written by the monks themselves. They were acutely aware of the fragility of life and the inevitability of decay. A poem on the ruins of a monastery might reflect on the generations of monks who had prayed there, their voices now silent, their names forgotten. But this sadness was always tempered by faith. The works of man might crumble into dust, but the word of God was eternal. The true monastery was not the one built of wood and stone, but the one built in the heart, the community of the faithful that would endure until the end of time. Let us examine the physical discipline of the monk in a different light. While it was undoubtedly harsh, it was also a source of a kind of freedom. By mastering his body's desires for food, comfort, and sleep, the monk believed he was achieving a state of spiritual liberation. He was freeing himself from the tyranny of his own appetites. In a world where most people were slaves to the seasons, to their own hunger, and to the will of their secular lords, the monk, through his discipline, achieved a radical kind of autonomy. He was the master of his own inner kingdom. This pursuit of spiritual freedom, of a life of purpose and intention, was one of the most powerful attractions of the monastic vocation. We can also see the monastery as a kind of time machine. The practice of reading the lives of the saints and of celebrating their feast days made the past a living reality. When the monks celebrated the feast of their founding saint, they would read the story of his life, sing hymns in his honour, and perhaps display his relics. The saint was not a distant historical figure. He was a living presence, a member of the community, their father and protector in heaven. This created a deep sense of continuity, a connection to a sacred history that stretched back through the generations. The monks saw themselves as the temporary caretakers of a tradition that was much larger and older than they were. The Irish monks also had a highly developed sense of humour, which is often evident in their stories and their marginalia. The lives of the saints are full of anecdotes that are clearly meant to be amusing. There are stories of saints outwitting pompous kings, of animals behaving in surprisingly human ways, and of monks getting into comical predicaments. This humour is often gentle and self-deprecating. It shows a community that was comfortable with its own humanity, that understood the absurdity of life, and that did not take itself too seriously. This ability to laugh, even in the midst of a life of great austerity, was a sign of spiritual health and balance. Let's consider the scriptorium one last time, not as a place of silent toil, but as a place of occasional quiet collaboration. While scribes often worked alone, large projects would have required a team. One monk might be ruling the pages, another writing the main text, and a third adding the decorated initials. There would have been a quiet professional camaraderie among these men. They would have shared techniques, discussed problems, and perhaps even competed with one another in a friendly way to produce the most beautiful work. The head of the scriptorium, the ferlenir or man of learning, would have been the master artist and project manager, directing the work and ensuring a consistent style and quality. The great manuscripts were not the work of a single, isolated genius, but the product of a highly organised and collaborative artistic workshop. The influence of their artistic style, the insular or Hiberno-Saxon style, was immense. When Irish and English missionaries travelled to the continent, they took their books with them, and they founded new scriptoria that followed their traditions. Manuscripts produced in great continental centres like Echternach, in modern Luxembourg, or Fulda in Germany, in the 8th and 9th centuries are almost indistinguishable from those produced in Ireland or Northumbria. The insular style became a major contributor to the development of Carolingian and later Romanesque art. The intricate interlace, the zoomorphic designs, and the love of abstract pattern that were perfected in the Irish monasteries became part of the fundamental visual vocabulary of medieval European art. Let us end our journey by returning to the individual monk. After a life of prayer and work, of discipline and study, what was the ultimate goal? It was a state of contemplative peace, a deep, abiding sense of communion with God. The Irish had a word for this, dúthracht, a kind of spiritual fervour or zealous devotion. But it was not a loud or ecstatic state. It was a quiet inner fire. The perfect monk was one who had so mastered his own will and passions that he could achieve a state of perfect tranquillity, his mind free from distraction, his heart open to the presence of God. The entire structure of monastic life was designed to make this state possible. It was the pearl of great price, for which the monk had willingly given up everything else the world had to offer. This quiet inner peace was the true treasure that they sought, more precious than any illuminated manuscript or golden chalice. The legacy of these communities is not only in the grand narrative of saving civilization, but also in these smaller, more intimate details of the human spirit. It is in the profound concept of the soul friend, the belief that the path to God is walked with a trusted companion. It is in the deep poetic appreciation for the beauty of the natural world, seeing the divine in the flight of a bird or the turning of a leaf. It is in the stubborn, resilient preservation of a nation's stories and memories in the face of conquest and cultural suppression. And it is in the simple, human act of a nameless monk, hunched over his desk in the cold, writing a poem to his cat, a tiny spark of warmth and wit that shines across a gulf of 1,200 years. The physical and mental health of the monks was a matter of constant concern, governed by a blend of spiritual belief and practical knowledge. The ideal was a state of balance, but the rigours of the life often led to extreme physical and psychological states. The visions and ecstatic experiences recorded in the lives of the saints might, in a modern context, be understood as products of extreme fasting, sleep deprivation, and sensory isolation. For the monks, however, these were genuine encounters with the divine, moments when the veil between this world and the next was torn away. They were signs of exceptional holiness, proof that the ascetic path could lead to a direct, unmediated experience of God. On the other hand, the community had to deal with what we would now call mental illness. The penitentials described treatments for conditions like madness or demonic possession. These treatments were a mixture of prayer, exorcism, and sometimes physical restraint. The monastery, in its role as a spiritual hospital, sought to heal the mind as well as the body and soul. For the lay community, a person who was mentally afflicted was often believed to be either touched by God or possessed by a demon, and they would be brought to the monastery for a spiritual diagnosis and cure. The monks were the custodians not only of knowledge, but of sanity itself, in a world that often teetered on the edge of chaos. The monastery's relationship with time was also unique. In a secular world governed by the sun and the seasons, the monks lived by a more complex, layered chronology. There was the daily clock of the 8 canonical hours. There was the weekly cycle, culminating in the Sunday celebration of the resurrection. And there was the great annual liturgical year, which reenacted the entire story of salvation, from the hopeful waiting of Advent, through the joy of Christmas, the solemn penance of Lent, the sorrow of Good Friday, the triumph of Easter, and the long season of Pentecost. To live in a monastery was to inhabit this sacred story, to experience time not as a linear progression, but as a spiral, always returning to the great central mysteries of the faith. This cyclical view of time gave their lives a profound sense of stability and meaning. No matter what was happening in the world outside, no matter which king was at war, whether the harvest was good or bad, the essential rhythm of the monastery continued, unchanging. The bell would ring for matins, the psalms would be sung, the mass would be celebrated. This relentless, predictable routine was not a form of drudgery. It was a source of immense comfort and security. It was a participation in the eternal, unchanging worship of the angels and saints in heaven. It was a way of building a small island of divine order in the midst of the turbulent sea of human history. Let us consider the landscape itself as a manuscript. The monks did not just write on vellum, they wrote on the earth. The very act of clearing a forest, draining a bog, and laying out fields in a regular pattern was an act of imposing a sacred, rational order on the wildness of nature. The vallum was the margin of the page. The church was the great illuminated capital letter at the centre. The rows of cells and workshops were the lines of text. The high crosses were the illustrations. To create a monastery was to transform a piece of the Irish wilderness into a living three-dimensional book, a landscape that could be read and interpreted as a story of faith, work, and salvation. The names of the places themselves became part of this sacred text. A place name like Glendalough, the Valley of the Two Lakes, is a simple geographical description. But for the medieval monk it was inseparable from the story of St. Kevin, who had made that valley holy. A name like Clonmacnoise, the meadow of the sons of Nos, was forever linked to its founder, St. Ciaran. The entire island became a memory palace, its place names triggering a vast web of stories about the saints who had lived and worked miracles there. This deep historical resonance of the landscape is another enduring legacy of the monastic age. The end of a monk's journey as a peregrinus was often not a return home, but a grave in a foreign land. The great continental monasteries founded by the Irish, like Bobbio in Italy or St. Gall in Switzerland, became major pilgrimage sites themselves because they held the relics of their revered Irish founders. A monk like Columbanus, who had given up his homeland for Christ, became a universal saint, a patron for the Italian and Frankish people he had adopted. His white martyrdom of exile was completed by a red martyrdom of the heart, his final, complete gift of himself to a people and a place that was not his own. This is the ultimate expression of the missionary ideal, to so completely identify with a new culture that you become one of its spiritual fathers. The libraries of these continental Irish foundations are a poignant testament to this dual identity. They contain magnificent universal texts like the Bible and the works of the Church Fathers, but tucked away among them you will find a grammar of the Old Irish language, or a copy of an Irish penitential, or a manuscript full of glosses in the scribe's native tongue. These books were the monks' umbilical cord to the culture they had left behind. They were scholars of the universal church, but they never forgot that they were Irish. This creative tension between the local and the universal, the native and the Roman, was one of the most powerful and productive forces in the history of the early medieval church. Let us imagine the sound of the language in the monastery. It was a multilingual environment. The sacred language, the language of the liturgy, of study, and of all formal writing was Latin. But it was a Latin spoken with a distinctively Irish accent and shaped by the grammatical structures of their own native tongue. The everyday language, the language of the fields and the workshop, the language used for informal conversation and for those intimate glosses in the margins, was Old Irish, and in a great centre like Clonmacnoise you would also hear the Anglo-Saxon of students from Northumbria, the Frankish dialects of pilgrims from Gaul, and later the Old Norse of the Hiberno-Norse traders from the nearby towns. The monastery was a linguistic crossroads, a place where the diverse voices of the early medieval world met and mingled. The tools of the monk beyond the scriptorium were simple but effective. The farmer had his heavy plough, his reaping hook for the harvest, and his spade. The carpenter had his axe, his adze for shaping timbers, his saw and his auger for drilling holes. The blacksmith had his forge, his bellows, his anvil, and his hammers. These tools were precious, carefully maintained and passed down through the generations. There was a deep embodied knowledge in the use of these tools, a skill that could not be learned from a book, but only through long years of practice. This practical, hands-on competence was the essential foundation that supported the monastery's more rarefied intellectual pursuits. The most sublime philosophy and the most beautiful art rested on the ability to grow food, to forge a nail, and to build a watertight roof. The monastery was also a place of political asylum. A king who had been defeated in battle and deposed by a rival might flee to a monastery that was allied with his family. There he could live in safety, protected by the sanctuary of the saint, while he plotted his return to power. This made the monasteries key players in the dynastic struggles of Gaelic Ireland. Supporting a particular royal candidate was a high-stakes game. If your candidate won, the monastery would be richly rewarded with grants of land and treasure. If he lost, the monastery might find itself on the wrong side of the new king and could face punishment, such as the confiscation of its lands. The line between the spiritual and the political was often dangerously blurred. Let's consider the light. In a world without artificial illumination beyond the candle and the rushlight, the daily and seasonal cycles of light and darkness had a profound impact. The winter months were a time of deep gloom. The days were short, and the long nights were a time of cold, darkness, and fear. The work of the scriptorium would have been almost impossible for much of the day. Winter was a time for indoor work, for mending tools, for prayer, and for study of texts already written. It was a time of introspection and waiting. The arrival of spring and the return of the light would have been a moment of profound joy and relief. The lengthening days meant more time for work in the fields, the reawakening of the natural world, and the great celebration of Easter, the feast of light triumphing over darkness. The summer, with its long, luminous evenings, was a time of intense activity, a race to get all the outdoor work done before the darkness closed in again. The monks' lives were tied to the great cosmic drama of the sun's journey, a drama that was both a practical reality and a powerful spiritual metaphor for the cycle of sin and redemption, death and resurrection. The art of the high crosses also evolved over time. The earliest crosses are more abstract, covered in patterns of interlace and spiral, much like the carpet pages of the manuscripts. The later crosses from the 9th and 10th centuries become more pictorial and narrative, with their detailed panels of biblical scenes. This may reflect a change in their function. The earlier crosses may have been primarily objects of contemplation, their abstract patterns designed to aid in meditation. The later narrative crosses seem to be designed more for teaching, for communicating the key stories of the faith to a lay audience. They are a form of public scripture, a sermon in stone that would be permanently accessible to all who visited the monastery. Finally, let us consider the end of this world not as a tragedy, but as a transformation. The uniquely Irish form of monasticism did not simply vanish, it was absorbed and adapted. Its achievements were so profound that they became part of the mainstream of European culture. The practice of private confession, the use of spaces between words, the tradition of scholarly inquiry, the vibrant artistic style, all of these were gifts that the Irish Church gave to the wider world. The old structures, the monasteries ruled by hereditary abbots, may have faded away, but the intellectual and spiritual DNA of those communities was passed on, shaping the Church and the culture of the Middle Ages in ways that are impossible to calculate. The fire that was kindled in those remote Irish valleys did not die out. It was passed from hand to hand, and its light became part of the enduring flame of Western civilization. Let's delve deeper into the specific character of Irish law, the Brehon Code, and its interaction with the monastic world. Unlike Roman law, which was based on state authority and territorial jurisdiction, Brehon law was personal and customary. It was a law of relationships, of kinship and status. A person's rights and duties were determined by their rank in society and their position within the clan. The monastery had to navigate this complex system. It was, in legal terms, a corporate entity, a kind of artificial clan, with the abbot as its chieftain and the monks and tenants as its members. When a crime was committed on monastic lands, a complex legal negotiation would often ensue. Did the case fall under the jurisdiction of the monastery's own court, applying church law, or did it fall under the authority of the local Brehon judge, applying the native secular law? Often, a hybrid solution was found. The monks, as the only literate class, were frequently called upon to act as scribes and legal experts, recording the judgments of the Brehon courts. They became masters of both legal systems, and their monasteries became centres of jurisprudence, preserving not only the laws of the Church, but also the ancient customary laws of their own people. This legal expertise made the abbots powerful figures. A wise abbot, respected for his knowledge of both canon and Brehon law, would be a highly sought-after arbitrator. Kings and chieftains would bring their most intractable disputes to him, trusting in his impartiality and his spiritual authority. This role as peacemaker and judge was one of the most important social functions of the monastery. It helped to impose a degree of order and justice on a society that lacked a strong, centralised state. The monastery was not just a place of prayer, it was a pillar of the legal and political order. The economy of salvation was a very real and tangible thing. When a wealthy patron made a grant of land to a monastery, the transaction was recorded in a charter, often written into the margins of the monastery's most sacred gospel book. This was not just a legal record, it was a sacred contract between the patron and the monastery's saint. The patron was, in effect, buying prayers for his soul. The monks were the spiritual brokers in this transaction. This created a powerful economic engine. The more powerful a monastery's saint was perceived to be, the more effective its prayers were thought to be, and the more patronage it would attract. This led to a kind of spiritual competition between the great monastic houses, each promoting the cult of its own founding saint to attract the most lucrative endowments. Let us think about the network of roads, or rather the lack of them. Ireland had very few of the paved Roman roads that crisscrossed Britain and the continent. Travel was difficult, often following rough tracks through forests and bogs. The easiest way to travel long distances was often by water, along the great rivers like the Shannon and the Bann, or by sea along the coast. This is why so many of the most important monasteries were located on major waterways. Clonmacnois on the Shannon, for example, was at the major north-south and east-west crossroads of the country. Its location was key to its success. It was not a remote retreat, but a bustling inland port, a hub for travellers, traders, and scholars from all four corners of Ireland. The boats they used were of two main types. For sea voyages, the most famous was the curragh, a light, flexible boat made of a wooden lattice frame covered with tanned ox hides. These boats were remarkably seaworthy, capable of surviving the fierce storms of the North Atlantic. It was in such a vessel that St. Brendan was said to have made his legendary voyage. For river travel, they also used simple dugout canoes, hollowed out from a single massive log. The monks were skilled boat builders and navigators, their lives often depending on their ability to read the winds, the tides, and the currents. Let's consider the symbolic importance of the island. The Irish landscape is full of islands, both in the sea and in its many lakes. For the monks, the island was the perfect natural metaphor for the monastic life. It was a world apart, a self-contained space separated from the mainland by a barrier of water. To choose to live on an island was a powerful statement of withdrawal from the secular world. Places like Iona, the Aran Islands, and Skellig Michael became legendary centres of holiness precisely because of their island location. They were seen as liminal spaces, thresholds between the human world and the divine, places where the veil was thin. The very act of foundation was often a dramatic story. A saint would arrive at a new site, and his first act would be to drive out the demonic or pagan forces that inhabited it. He would fast and pray for 40 days, consecrating the ground. He would perform a miracle to demonstrate his divine authority, perhaps striking a rock to make a holy well spring forth. He would then mark out the boundary of the sacred enclosure, the vallum. This foundation story was a crucial part of the monastery's identity. It was retold every year on the founder's feast day, reminding the community of their sacred origins and the spiritual power they had inherited. The idea of the green martyrdom deserves a final, deeper look. It was not just about hardship. It was about a specific kind of spiritual warfare. The monk who went into the wilderness was deliberately seeking out a confrontation. The wild, untamed places of the landscape were believed to be the dwelling places of demons and fallen pagan gods. The hermit's cell was an outpost, a forward operating base in enemy territory. His constant prayer and fasting were his weapons. By living a life of heroic virtue in this place, he was reclaiming it for Christ, taming it not with the plough, but with the power of the Spirit. Every hermit who successfully maintained his vigil was expanding the boundaries of Christendom, pushing back the frontiers of darkness. This worldview explains the many stories in the lives of the saints where they have power over wild animals. A saint might be fed by an otter, or a wolf might guard his sheep. These were not just charming fairy tales, they were theological statements. The original harmony of Eden, where Adam had dominion over the animals, was lost through sin. The holy man, through his extreme sanctity, was believed to have restored a piece of that original unfallen state. His ability to command the loyalty of wild creatures was a sign that he had overcome the brokenness of the fallen world and was living in a state of renewed grace. The veneration of relics was a central part of this culture. The most important relic of a monastery was the body of its founding saint, which would be buried under the high altar of the main church. Over time, the saint's bones might be exhumed and placed in a magnificent, house-shaped shrine, making them more visible and accessible to pilgrims. But relics were not just bones. A saint's personal possessions, his bell, his crozier, his gospel book, were also believed to be imbued with his spiritual power. These relics were the monastery's spiritual nuclear weapons. They were used to guarantee oaths, to heal the sick, and even, as we have seen, carried into battle to ensure victory. The politics of medieval Ireland cannot be understood without understanding the immense power, both spiritual and political, that was invested in these sacred objects. Let's imagine the atmosphere inside the Round Tower during a Viking raid. It would be cramped, dark, and terrifying. Dozens of monks and perhaps some lay people would be crowded together on the small wooden floors, which were connected by ladders. The air would be thick with the smell of fear and the sound of desperate prayer. Below, they would hear the shouts of the raiders, the splintering of wood as they broke into the church, and the screams of those who had not made it to safety. The only light would come from the narrow slit windows. The monks would watch helplessly as their home was plundered and burned. The Round Tower was a refuge, but it was also a prison, a place of agonising suspense, where the community could do nothing but wait and pray for the storm to pass. The intellectual legacy of the Irish monks was not just in the preservation of texts, but in the development of a particular intellectual style. Their writing is often characterised by a love of complexity, of intricate argument, and of encyclopedic displays of knowledge. They delighted in obscure words, in complex grammatical constructions, and in weaving together sources from a vast range of authorities. This style, sometimes called Hispiric Latin, can seem dense and overly elaborate to a modern reader, but it was the product of a culture that saw intellectual difficulty as a spiritual challenge. To master a difficult text was a form of ascetic discipline for the mind, a way of training the intellect to be a worthy instrument for the contemplation of God. Let us consider the end of the day. As the sun set, the monks would gather for Compline, the last prayer of the evening. It was a quiet, contemplative service. The prayers asked for God's protection through the dangers of the night. After Compline, the great silence began. No one was permitted to speak until the first service of the next morning. The monks would retire to their cold, dark cells. For the devout monk, this was not a time for sleep, but for the most intense and personal form of prayer. Alone in the darkness, he would examine his conscience, confess his sins directly to God, and meditate on the great mysteries of the faith. It was in this profound silence, in this solitude, that the monk hoped to hear the still, small voice of God. This silent, prayerful darkness was the spiritual soil from which the magnificent achievements of the day would grow. The monastery was also an archive of the mundane. While their most famous works are the great illuminated Gospels, the monks also kept meticulous records of the monastery's own business. They recorded land grants, legal disputes, and lists of tenants and their rents. These documents, while lacking the artistic glamour of the great codices, are invaluable to historians. They give us a detailed picture of the monastery as a working agricultural estate and a major economic power. They show us that the life of the monastery was not all high theology and sublime art. It was also about managing herds of cattle, collecting rents, and ensuring that there was enough grain in the storehouse to last the winter. The interaction between the monastic and the bardic traditions is a fascinating story. The Fili, the hereditary class of poets and guardians of oral tradition, were the intellectual rivals of the monks. In the early period there was often tension between them, but over time a synthesis emerged. The monks began to write down the oral tales that the Fili had preserved. The Fili, in turn, began to compose poems on Christian themes and for ecclesiastical patrons. By the later medieval period the distinction between the two had blurred. The great poetic families often worked in close association with the monasteries, and the monasteries became the most important centres for the preservation of the Gaelic literary tradition. This fusion of the Christian Latin and the native oral traditions is what gave late medieval Irish culture its unique and vibrant character. Let us imagine the creation of a high cross from the very beginning. The The abbot and the master mason would first have to select the right block of sandstone from a quarry, a massive, flawless piece. Getting this stone, which could weigh several tons from the quarry to the monastery, would be a monumental feat of engineering, requiring levers, rollers, sledges, and the coordinated effort of dozens of men and oxen. Once at the site, the mason and his apprentices would begin the slow work of shaping the stone. They would use hammers and chisels to rough out the basic shape of the cross and the ring. Then the master carver, a highly skilled artist, would take over. He would draw the designs for the panels directly onto the stone. Then, with a fine chisel and a mallet, he would begin to carve. This was incredibly skilled and painstaking work. A single mistake could ruin a whole section. For months, perhaps even years, the sound of the carver's tools would be a constant presence in the monastery. He would slowly bring the biblical figures to life, carving the details of their faces, their clothing, and the objects they held. When he was finished, the monastery would have a magnificent new public monument, a testament to its wealth, its piety, and its commitment to the arts. This cross would stand for over 1,000 years, a silent witness to the changing fortunes of the community that created it. The Irish monks also played a key role in the transmission of science and natural philosophy. While their worldview was not scientific in the modern sense, they were the custodians of the classical knowledge that was available. They copied and studied the works of authors like Pliny the Elder and Isidore of Seville, who had compiled vast encyclopedias of knowledge about the natural world. They were particularly skilled in computus, the complex science of calendar calculation, which required a sophisticated understanding of mathematics and astronomy. The Irish scholar Dickwill, writing in the 9th century, produced a work on geography that included remarkably accurate descriptions of places as far-flung as Iceland and Egypt, based on the accounts of travelling monks. They were not original scientific researchers, but they were the essential bridge that carried the legacy of classical scientific thought across the chasm of the Dark Ages. The physical act of writing for hours on end, day after day, took a terrible toll on the scribe's body. In the margins of their manuscripts, they sometimes left notes complaining of their physical ailments. "My hand is weary with writing," says one. "The ink is thin, the vellum is greasy, and my eyesight is failing," laments another. These were not just idle complaints. They were the honest testimony of men who were pushing their bodies to the absolute limit in the service of their craft. The beautiful, seemingly effortless flow of the script on the page is a lie. It was produced through immense physical effort and discomfort. Each letter was a small victory of the scribe's will over the frailty of his own body. Finally, let us consider the world that was lost. We can reconstruct the daily routine, analyse the art, and trace the political history of the monasteries. But there are some things we can never fully recover. We cannot hear the sound of their chant, or the specific dialect of Latin they spoke. We cannot know the precise content of the sermons the abbot preached, or the stories the monks told each other in the evenings. We cannot truly enter into their mental world, a world where miracles were a daily reality, and the presence of saints and demons was taken for granted. There is a gulf of experience that separates our secular scientific age from their age of faith. To study them is to be constantly aware of this distance, to feel a sense of profound wonder, and to acknowledge that there are some secrets that history will always keep. The food of the monastery, while simple, was subject to the strictures of the liturgical calendar. The period of Lent, the 40 days before Easter, was a time of extreme fasting. The monks would likely have abstained from all animal products, including eggs and dairy, subsisting on a meagre diet of bread, water, and vegetables. By contrast, the great feast days of Christmas and Easter were times of celebration, when the rule was relaxed. The community might be treated to meat, perhaps roast pork or beef from their own herds, and a better quality of ale from the brewery. These feasts were important not just for morale, but as a tangible expression of the joy of the liturgical season. The rhythm of fasting and feasting was another way that the sacred story was written onto the bodies of the monks themselves. Let us examine the role of the master craftsman more closely, whether he was a master scribe, a master mason, or a master metalworker. This figure was a person of immense importance and prestige within the monastic community. He was the keeper of the technical secrets of his craft. knowledge that was passed down through a long apprenticeship. He would have been responsible for training the next generation of craftsmen, for sourcing the finest materials, and for designing the great works of art that the monastery produced. While the monks valued humility, the pride of the master craftsman in his own skill is often palpable. In the Book of Kells, for example, the sheer virtuosity and playful complexity of the decoration feels like a joyful, exuberant display of artistic genius, a celebration of the creative power that the artist believed was a gift from God. The monastery's relationship with the surrounding natural environment was one of both exploitation and reverence. On the one hand, they were transforming the landscape, clearing forests for farmland and quarrying stone for their buildings. They were harnessing the power of the rivers with their mills. On the other hand, as we have seen, they had a deep, almost mystical appreciation for the beauty of the wilderness. This is not a contradiction. For them, the created world was a gift from God, given to humanity to be both used for its sustenance and admired for its beauty. Their goal was a kind of sustainable, prayerful stewardship of the land, a middle path between a purely utilitarian exploitation and a hands-off preservation. The cult of the saints had a very practical, almost legalistic dimension. A saint was not just a role model. He was a patron and a protector with a continuing interest in the affairs of his own monastic foundation. An offence against the monastery, stealing its cattle, harming one of its monks, was seen as a personal insult to the saint himself, who was expected to intervene directly to punish the offender. The lives of the saints are full of stories of chieftains who wronged a monastery and were subsequently struck down by a mysterious illness or defeated in battle. These stories served as a powerful deterrent, a form of supernatural security system that helped to protect the monastery's property and personnel in a lawless age. Let's imagine the emotional life of a boy given to the monastery as an oblate. He would have been separated from his family at a young age, raised in a world of adult men, in an atmosphere of strict discipline and emotional restraint. He would have been taught to suppress his own feelings, to redirect his love towards God, and to find his identity within the community. While he would have formed strong bonds with his teachers and his fellow novices, his life would have lacked the warmth and intimacy of a family. This upbringing would have produced men of incredible self-discipline and fortitude, but perhaps also men who struggled with loneliness and a deep, unfulfilled longing for human connection. The intense platonic friendship of the Anamkara may have been, in part, a way of filling this emotional void. The Irish monks' contribution to the preservation of law was not limited to Irish law. They also played a role in the preservation of Roman and barbarian legal codes on the continent. In their continental scriptoria, they copied not only the Bible and the classics, but also legal texts like the Theodosian Code or the Salic Law of the Franks. Their work was essential for the rulers of the new Germanic kingdoms, who were attempting to create stable legal systems for their realms. The monks were the indispensable legal secretaries of the early medieval world. Their literacy and their organisational skills the bedrock upon which the nascent states of Europe were built. The physical act of chanting the Psalms for several hours every day was a form of breath control and vocal training that would have had a profound physical and psychological effect. It was a kind of collective ritualised breathing exercise. The unison singing would have required each monk to listen intently to his brothers, to subordinate his own voice to the single voice of the choir. This would have fostered a deep sense of unity and communal identity. The vibrations of the chant resonating in the stone chapel would have created a powerful, immersive sonic environment that could induce a state of heightened awareness and spiritual receptivity. The chant was not just prayer, it was a form of psychoacoustic technology designed to transform consciousness. The idea of pilgrimage to Ireland was a real phenomenon. In the 7th and 8th centuries, a stream of Anglo-Saxon nobles and scholars travelled to Ireland, which they regarded as a holy land, a place of pristine faith and unparalleled learning. The Anglo-Saxon historian Bede wrote that many English students flocked to Ireland to pursue religious studies and to lead a more disciplined life. He noted that the Irish monks willingly received them all and provided them with daily food without charge and also with books to read and with instruction without asking for any payment. Ireland became, for a time, the university of the Anglo-Saxon world, a testament to the international reputation of its monastic schools. Let us consider the final moments of a manuscript's creation. The last word of the text has been written. The last touch of paint has been applied to the last illumination. The binder has sewn the quires and attached the covers. A book that has been the focus of the community's efforts for years is finally complete. The abbot and the monks would gather in the scriptorium or the church. The book would be presented. There would be a sense of profound accomplishment, of relief, and of awe. A new, holy object had been brought into the world. A special mass of thanksgiving would be celebrated. The book, still smelling of fresh ink and leather, would be placed on the altar, its magnificent covers gleaming in the candlelight. It was a moment of triumph, a victory against the forces of time and forgetting, a testament to the enduring power of faith, art, and human perseverance. The tools of the illuminator were as specialised as those of the scribe. He used fine brushes, made from the tail hair of martins or squirrels, set into bird quill handles. He had a burnisher, a smooth hard stone or a piece of polished bone, for polishing the gold leaf until it shone like a mirror. He had a compass and a ruler for laying out the complex geometric designs that formed the underlying structure of many of his patterns. He had small pots, made of shell or horn, for mixing his precious pigments. This was the toolkit of a jeweller or a watchmaker, designed for work of the utmost precision and delicacy. The illuminator was a micro-engineer of the sacred, building a complex and beautiful world on the fragile surface of a page. The Irish conception of sainthood was different from that of the Roman Church. In Rome, a saint was officially recognised by the Pope through a formal process of canonisation. In Ireland, a saint was acclaimed by the people. A holy man or woman who had lived a life of extraordinary virtue and performed miracles would be recognised as a saint by their local community after their death. A cult would grow up around their tomb, and their life would be written by the monks of their foundation. This created a vast pantheon of local Irish saints, many of whom are unknown outside of the country. This localised popular approach to sainthood is another example of the decentralised and deeply rooted character of the early Irish Church. Let us consider the monastery at night. The great silence is in effect. The only light is the single candle of the sanctuary lamp, burning perpetually before the altar in the church. The wind howls outside the stone walls. The monks are asleep in their cells, but the life of the monastery does not completely stop. One monk, the sacristan, has the duty of staying awake, or waking at intervals, to tend the sanctuary lamp and to prepare the church for the first service of the night. He moves like a ghost through the silent, dark buildings, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness. His lonely vigil is a symbol of the monastery itself, a single, small point of light and watchfulness in the midst of a vast sleeping darkness. The very ink they used was a testament to their connection with the natural world. The oak galls from which it was made were a product of a complex biological interaction between an insect and a tree. To create the ink, the monks had to understand this process, to know when and where to gather the galls and how to process them. Their most fundamental tool of learning was a product of their deep, practical knowledge of the forest. The words of God were written on an animal's skin with the juice of a tree, a perfect metaphor for the way in which the Irish monastic imagination fused the spiritual and the natural into a seamless whole. The end of the old Gaelic monastic world was not a single event, but a long, slow unwinding that lasted for centuries. Even after the Reformation, remnants of the old ways survived in the remote Gaelic-speaking parts of the country. Secret masses were said in the ruins of the old abbeys. The local people continued to venerate the holy wells and to tell the stories of the old saints. The tradition of native Irish learning was carried on by hereditary families of scribes, who continued to copy the old manuscripts. It was a culture that refused to die, a ghost that continued to haunt the Irish landscape, a quiet but persistent refusal to forget. The echoes of that lost world can still be heard today, if one knows how and where to listen. Let us imagine the soundscape just outside the monastery walls. It would not have been silent. You would hear the lowing of the monastery's cattle, the bleating of its sheep. You would hear the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer from the workshop, the thud of the carpenter's axe, and the shouts of the farmers directing their oxen in the fields. You would hear the voices of children, the sons of tenants playing in the fields. The monastery was not an oasis of absolute silence, but an island of sacred, ordered sound in the midst of a world of secular, productive sound. The ringing of the monastery bell did not interrupt the silence. It imposed its sacred rhythm on the existing, bustling soundscape of daily life. The high crosses were likely once painted in bright, vibrant colours, just like the illuminations in the manuscripts. The carved figures of Christ and the saints would have been brought to life with pigments made from red and yellow ochre, white lead, and black carbon. The intricate patterns of interlace would have been picked out in contrasting colours. We must imagine these monuments not as the monochrome, weathered grey stones we see today, but as dazzling, polychrome objects, gleaming with colour and perhaps even embellished with gold leaf. They would have been the spectacular technicolor centerpieces of the monastic enclosure, their stories and their beauty visible and compelling to all who saw them. Let us take a final look at the paradox of their historical position. They were geographically isolated, yet intellectually cosmopolitan. Their society was rural and non-urban, yet they produced art and scholarship of world-class sophistication. They were fiercely independent, yet they saw themselves as faithful members of the universal church. They were ascetics, who renounced the world, yet they became powerful and wealthy political players. It is in these creative tensions, these seeming contradictions, that the unique genius of the Irish monastic culture is to be found. They were a people who managed to hold opposing ideas in a delicate, fruitful balance, creating a civilization that was at once deeply rooted in its own native soil and profoundly universal in its aspirations and its influence.